Section 1 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Greenman. March 7, 1920. Remodeling Twain home. Hartford mansion. Holland House pictures shipped to Hartford, Connecticut. Following the sale of furnishings of the old Holland House at 30th Street and Fifth Avenue, the doors and bathroom fixtures are now being removed and shipped to Hartford, Connecticut. They are to be used in remodeling the former residence of Mark Twain into small apartments, and will also go toward equipping a $1,500,000 apartment building which will be erected on part of the old Clemens estate. Most of the 2,000 doors in the old hotel are being shipped to Hartford. The purchase includes the hinges, brass knobs, and door jambs. Each set, it was said, would cost $25 to reproduce. The purchase price is $3. The 160 bathtubs have been bought for $15,000. End of Section 1, March 7, 1920. Remodeling Twain home. Read by John Greenman. Section 2 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. March 21, 1920. Topics of the week: Changing humor. Editorial related to Van Wyck Brooks. It has not needed the careful retrospective estimate that a great writer's death usually brings to his works for the reading public to have come to the conclusion years ago that Samuel L. Clemens measures up to a vastly more complex figure in literature than the mere funny man that his first and amazingly popular achievements in authorship seemed to make him. Such books as his Joan of Arc or The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg give evidence enough of the deep vein of seriousness underlying some of his work, and that is present, more or less remotely it is true, in practically all of it. We think of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn as irresistibly funny books, and so they are, but not throughout. The serious Mark Twain is in them, too, even if not quite so unmistakably present as in that mordant satire, The Mysterious Stranger, or that gloomiest of philosophical essays, What is Man? Thankful should we be, too, that this vein of seriousness was richly overlaid with the grace of laughter, even though that laughter does not seem quite so spontaneous and natural as in the days when we were fairly rolling over with the mirth of Innocents Abroad, Roughing It, The Gilded Age, books that, if they make us laugh at all today, make us laugh at them, not with them. But now there comes Mr. Van Wyck Brooks, who emphasizes and elaborates this view of Mark Twain's genius with a novel and fascinating theory, which he develops in an article appearing in this month's Dial, to the effect that Clemens was a humorist purely through force of circumstance; that by inclination, nature, and to a certain extent by environment and upbringing, he was a satirist, a sort of speechless Hamlet, oppressed by the world's miseries, or a Dean Swift, lacking the courage or the opportunity to flay mankind for its frailties. Thus Mr. Clemens appears as a man who failed to give to the world, except through intermittent, elusive flashes, the real truth that was in him, and who forced himself instead to play the part of a buffoon throughout his literary career, a part that, in his secret heart, he most abhorred. We call this theory fascinating because of the dramatic picture it leaves in the mind of a great literary genius who condemns himself to a sort of Jekyll and Hyde existence, who deliberately takes upon himself the role of international fun maker when he would far rather have drowned the stage in tears. There is always a strong appeal in that perennial story of the famous clown who made the galleries roar with his ridiculous antics, while his own melancholy thoughts were with his wife, dying alone in her desolate home. In all of us there is enough of the feeling for melodrama aroused to appreciate the pathetic life tragedy back of that sort of situation, and when somebody tells us, paralleling this old time story, that one of the world's favorite humorists was accustomed to laugh when he was really in a black mood, just the reverse from laughter, we are attracted by the idea and are more than half inclined to believe it before weighing the proof. Moreover, Mr. Brooks does furnish an abundance of proof in support of his theory, so much so, indeed, that few of us, reading his article on the subject, will come away without a considerably revised opinion as to Mark Twain's genius. Mr. Clemens started his literary career writing for and as a part of American pioneer life. Circumstances threw him, during his early impressionable years, into the rough, uncultured environment of the Western mining camps, and it was there, in defense practically of his own sensitive nature, and longing for some kind of expression, however remote, of his artistic life, that he became the creator of an exaggerated humor that won him instant fame, and that he was compelled to keep on creating, much as he despised it, to the end of his career. Here we have the psychogenesis of Mark Twain's humor, an outlet of some kind that prodigious energy of his was bound to have, and this outlet, since he had been unable to throw himself wholeheartedly into mining, had to be one which, in some way, however obliquely, expressed the artist in him. That expression, nevertheless, had also to be one which, far from outraging public opinion, would win its emphatic approval. Mark Twain was obliged to remain a good fellow in order to succeed, in order to satisfy his inordinate will to power, and we know how he acquiesced in the suppression of all those manifestations of his individuality, his natural freedom of sentiment, his love of reading, his constant desire for privacy, that struck his comrades as different or superior. His choice of a pen name, indeed, proves how urgently he felt the need of a protective coloration in this society where the writer was a despised type. Too sensitive to relieve himself by horseplay, he had what one might call a preliminary recourse in his profanity, those scorching, singeing blasts he was always directing at his companions. And that this in a measure appeased him we can see from Mr. Paine's remark that his profanity seemed "the safety valve of his high pressure intellectual engine. Blank. When he had blown off he was always calm, gentle, forgiving, and even tender." We can best see his humor, then, precisely as Mr. Paine seems to see it, in the phrase, "Men laughed when they could no longer swear," as the expression, in short, of a psychic stage one step beyond the stage where he could find relief in swearing as a harmless moral equivalent, in other words, of those acts of violence which his own sensitiveness and his fear of consequences alike prevented him from committing. By means of ferocious jokes, and most of Mark Twain's early jokes are of a ferocity that will hardly be believed by any one who has not examined them critically, he could vent his hatred of pioneer life and all its conditions, those conditions that were thwarting his creative life. He could, in this vicarious manner, appease the artist in him, while at the same time keeping on the safe side of public opinion, the very act of transforming his aggressions into jokes rendering them innocuous. And what made it a relief to him made it also popular. The atmosphere of the mining camp does indeed pervade the typical Mark Twain humor, a humor that finds its effect, that makes its point, in some grotesque bit of exaggeration. It was burlesque, as a rule, the kind of humor that is least akin to nature, that usually springs, on the contrary, from a distortion of nature, and, as Mr. Brooks points out, during that epoch of industrial pioneering, blank, the whole country was as thirsty for humor as it was for ice water, and as a result Mark Twain's humor fulfilled during its generation a national demand as universal in America as the demand fulfilled in Russia by Dostoyevsky, in France by Victor Hugo, in England by Dickens. But it was distinctly a forced humor. Mark Twain was not alone in using it. On the contrary, it was shared by a whole school of pioneer fun makers recalled by Mr. Brooks: Artemus Ward, Orpheus C. Kerr, Petroleum V. Nasby, Dan DeQuille, Captain Jack Downing, etc. And today how the national feeling for fun has changed! Irresistibly funny, as these writers all were, with Mark Twain at their head 50 years ago, how doleful is most of their humor today. When Mr. Drinkwater's Lincoln gives the historic reading from Artemus Ward at a cabinet meeting, how many of his 20th century audience find food for laughter in what this famous fun maker of the '50s and early '60s had to say? But it was just the kind of humor that could best lighten the tragic burden borne by the martyr President. If it has lost the secret for producing laughter, it is because we, not Artemus Ward, have changed. Most of the world's humor, indeed, especially if it is born of a transient national mood, belongs distinctly to an age, and not to all time. And that is why, perhaps, the humor of Mark Twain does not bulk so large with us today as the satirical, serious side of his work, for it is very certain that his work has its deep, serious side, and that this reveals, as Mr. Van Wyck Brooks claims, more of the real Mark Twain than the side given up to laughter and literary horseplay. End of Section 2, March 21, 1920. Changing Humor. Editorial related to Van Wyck Brooks. Read by John Greenman. Section 3 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. April 4, 1920. Mark Twain. Editorial related to Gamaliel Bradford, and Mark Twain's Hartford home. Letter to the editor. Mark Twain. It was William D. Howells who said of his friend Mark Twain that he will be remembered with the great humorists of all time, with Cervantes, with Swift, or with any others of his company. None of them was his equal in humanity. In an intimate study of Mark Twain in the April Atlantic Monthly, Gamaliel Bradford dissents. It is true, he says, that Mark Twain "could find the laughable element in everything; true that he had that keen sense of melancholy which is inseparable from the richest comedy." Mr. Bradford goes on to say, to justify his opinion, that his subject should not be classed with the great humorists of the past. Somehow in Mark the humor and the pathos are not perfectly blended. The laughter is wild and exuberant as heart can desire, but it does not really go to the bottom of things. Serious matters, so called serious matters, are taken too seriously, and under the laughter there is a haunting basis of wrath and bitterness and despair. It is declared by this critic, who is an admirer of Mark Twain, that he was a superficial thinker, and seemed "like a man discovering things which are perfectly well known to trained thinkers," treating them with such spirit and interest as to convey the impression to casual readers that he had tapped a source of originality. There was no resisting his vivacity, his ingenious extravagance, and a style as versatile as it was vigorous convinced and charmed. There will be many to agree with Mr. Bradford that Mark Twain in early years "let the great problems alone, did not analyze, did not philosophize, content to extract immense joviality from the careless surface of life, and not to probe further." Can it be disputed that much of the
jesting of Mark's youthful days is so trivial that it distinctly implies the absence of steady thinking on any subject. A good deal of Old Times on the Mississippi, Roughing It, and Innocents Abroad is the broadest, the most extravagant farce, which palls on later reading, when Mark Twain does not seem so funny as he was at first. And yet there were no bounds to his efforts to amuse. He did not have that reserve of the great humorists which makes their finest passages immortal. Mr. Howells is probably right in claiming for Mark Twain superior humanity, in the sense that he mingled with all kinds of people, understood them, their good qualities, their individual characteristics, their foibles, and their frailties. He liked, but he also hated. He was a man of strong feelings, although he preferred to be thought flippant, except by his friends, who could never admire and esteem him enough. What could be more human and self revealing than Mark's summing up of himself? "I have been an author for 20 years, and an ass for 55." Who could fail to love a man of jest and sageness for such an avowal, knowing that the depreciation was as unjust as it was sincere? Friends of Mark Twain who knew the man as well as the author will perhaps be offended by the searching candor of Gamaliel Bradford, but they will have to set off against his sometimes caustic judgments, which, however, are always friendly, such tributes as this: "Few human beings ever lived who had a nicer conscience and a finer and more delicate fulfillment of duty." Again, says this critic, "Human tenderness and kindliness and sympathy have rarely been more highly developed than in this man who questioned their existence." It hardly seems necessary to have said that Mark Twain's place is not with "the great, broad, sunshiny laughers, Lamb, Cervantes, and the golden comedy of Shakespeare," but with the satirists Molière, Ben Jonson, and Swift, who had their dark moments and railed against the world. If Mark Twain was not one of the greater humorists and a philosopher of the first class, he was undeniably and always a fun maker and just as surely a moralist. But it can never be said that he was not a true painter of contemporary life and a lover of his kind. One has only to turn over again the leaves of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn to know this and always maintain it. His fame will rest upon these two books, and it will be permanent. Mark Twain's Hartford home. To the Editor of the New York Times: In the Hartford Courant of March 30th there appeared on the first page protests from "people of national reputation" over the threatened destruction of Mark Twain's home in Hartford, a literary and historic landmark which the Society of Connecticut Artists is doing its utmost to save. Letters from every quarter of the country are daily swamping the Society's headquarters at 92 Pratt Street, showing that a storm of indignation has been aroused by the proposed desecration. It seems particularly fitting that this plan should be carried out successfully. We have few enough memorials of great artists and thinkers. Of Mark Twain there is the one at his birthplace, Hannibal, Missouri, but it is said that the house called Stormfield at Reading is falling into ruin. It is very likely that many may agree with President G. L. McIntosh of Wabash College, Crawfordsville, Indiana, who wrote: "I think this is a worthy effort. We are too carefree in this country in preserving our ancient landmarks." This movement is being led by Nunzio Vaiana, Secretary of the Society of Connecticut Artists. It has point now, aside from the danger of the destruction of the charming Twain home, for November 30th will be the 85th anniversary of the birth of Twain, and this year is also the 10th anniversary of his death. And perhaps Twain's "A Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court"
would be a sufficient reason for the preservation of the Hartford house. The best reason of all, though, is Mark Twain's lasting power to win our first and second year high school pupils, especially those of foreign or limited background, to an enjoyment of books and even of libraries. For these reasons this project seems an admirable plan to cultivate our appreciation and reverence, and as one means for keeping fresh the memory of Mark Twain, who still helps to keep the world young. As a practical way of realizing such a project, would it not be feasible for the Society of Connecticut Artists to ask United States Commissioner Claxon to request the cooperation of all the State Commissioners of Education in setting a Mark Twain Memorial Week with a program of appropriate topics, leading to a penny or more drive in each school, the funds from which to be the gift of the children of the United States for the future school children? John L. Foley, New York, March 29, 1920. End of Section 3, April 4, 1920. Mark Twain, an editorial, and Mark Twain's Hartford home. Letter to the editor. Read by John Greenman. Section 4 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. April 6, 1920. Mark Twain's House. Poem about Hartford Mansion. Lo, men for gain would tear his homestead down, the home of him who touched the heart of youth to leaping laughter at his living truth. Now Tom and Huck, the prince and pauper, frown. The Yankee to King Arthur cries, "Forsooth, my modern fellows do but show the tooth." Jones smiles wise in a blue-silvered gown. He needs no bronze or stone memorial. His art brought down a white undying fire to shine on time and gleam through this gray day. Yet we will keep his home a sign to all of our deep debt to him whose high desire found lusty joy along the common way. John L. Foley. End of Section 4, April 6, 1920. Mark Twain's House. Poem about Hartford Mansion. Read by John Greenman. Section 5 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. April 18, 1920. Mark Twain Memorial. To the editor of the New York Times. The Hartford Courant recently printed an excellent account, verbatim, of two real estate speculators dictating to Nuncio Vaiana, secretary of the Society of Connecticut Artists, about their selling Mark Twain's Hartford home for $245,000, more than they paid for it. They're not caring for the great American humorist, and they're not courting public opinion. The reporters who were in the studio to record the results of the Connecticut Artists' annual prize competition heard easily over a low dividing paper-board partition and revealed a shocking disregard of the real estate men for Mark Twain, for art, and the public altogether. Since then the reaction they provoked, under the constant leadership of the Hartford Courant, has aroused a nation-wide protesting public with telling effect. These results may be summarized as follows: 1. That the Connecticut State Park Commission has the legal power, under the right of eminent domain, to condemn the Twain property as a historic site. 2. That a public hearing on Monday, before that commission, at Hartford, Governor Marcus Holcomb condemned in scathing terms these speculators, adding that the court would not be cautious about considering technical rights concerning them, and 3. That the governor said, "The first thing is to get your contributions sufficient to meet whatever expenditure you may need." Further, In making practical the plan I suggested in my letter to the New York Times of April 4th for securing such funds, the United States Commissioner, P. P. Claxton, told me here last night that he would be willing to sponsor or to aid, under proper auspices, a plan to cooperate with the State Commissioners in the nation for a Mark Twain week, culminating in a gift from American school children of a penny or more to preserve Mark Twain's Hartford home for the children of the future. John L. Foley, New York, April 17, 1920. End of Section 5, April 18, 1920. Mark Twain Memorial. Read by John Greenman. Section 6 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. May 17, 1920. Topics of the time. Coercion can be applied. A decidedly curious situation has been created, and a delicate legal question is raised, by an inquiry recently addressed to the Attorney General of Connecticut by the Park Commission of the State. What the commissioners wanted to know was whether they could condemn and take over under their power of eminent domain the house and grounds in Hartford where Mark Twain lived, and turn the estate into a permanent memorial of the dead writer. It seems that the present owners of the property demand for it a price which the members of the Mark Twain Memorial Association consider unreasonably high, and this is evidently the belief, too, of the Hartford Courant, for that paper characterizes those owners in severe terms for the little regard they have shown for the carrying out of a plan the execution of which would be a cause of keen satisfaction all over the country. As evidently the Attorney General is in sympathy with the purposes of those who are trying to preserve in its present condition a place with which are linked so many fine associations, and to prevent the erection on the land of a group of big apartment houses. In a long opinion, supported by many citations of decisions rendered in cases which he declares relevant, the Attorney General declares that the Park Commission's power to take property is unquestionable, but he advises that the Memorial Association have in hand, before the condemnation proceedings begin, enough money to pay whatever the Park Commission may decide to be a reasonable price for the house and the 7 acres of ground in which it stands. These are public purposes. There is no doubt, of course, as to the power of a State or municipal board to take, at an appraised value, land for a park, the need for which has been duly recognized. The question at issue is whether or not the commemoration of a literary man's memory is a public purpose, in the legal meaning of that phrase. There are intentions, the Attorney General holds, that bring the project well within the domain where the right of eminent domain can be exercised with propriety. "This recreation place," he writes, "will not only benefit the general welfare of our people, but it will be the Mecca for people from every country in the world." That is an exaggeration so slight as to be permissible, the part of the world not interested in Mark Twain and his work not having much right to be considered in such a matter. The thing to do now is to raise the money with which to pay the price the owners of the Mark Twain home ought to get, as distinguished from the price they want to get. The Hartford Courant is ready to accept contributions, large or small, and take care of them. End of Section 6, May 17, 1920. Coercion can be applied. Read by John Greenman. Section 7 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. June 27, 1920. Mark Twain, Chief of Sinners. Book review of The Ordeal of Mark Twain, by William Lyon Phelps. The Ordeal of Mark Twain, by Van Wyck Brooks, New York, E. P. Dutton & Company. 10 years have passed since the death of Mark Twain. During these 10 years his fame has grown steadily brighter, his personality more salient and imposing, his masterpieces more mountainous. Time's silent but effective methods of cancellation, which bury a reputation without leaving a monument, seem powerless here. As all the sand in Egypt cannot cover the pyramids, so the ever falling drift of days cannot obliterate genius. Many books have been written about Mark Twain, but with the exception of Paine's biography, perhaps the best biography ever written by an American, this work by Mr. Van Wyck Brooks is the most important and the most essential. Mr. Brooks is one of our ablest critics, for he combines catholicity of taste with an almost austere sincerity. His book, like all books filled with ideas, is a challenge. It contains so much truth that it provokes and disturbs the reader, as all critical writing should do. Emerson said, "God offers to every mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please. You can never have both." I say that this book contains much truth. I do not think it contains all the truth, or that it is wholly true, but it is packed with ideas. Ideas have always interested mankind more than facts, because every idea is a challenge, a summons to thought. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. That is a fact. But no man will die for it. We fight and die only for things that cannot be proved. There is something finished about a fact. It has lost the principle of development. It is dead. Ideas are alive. The main idea in this book is that Mark Twain's career was a tragedy for himself and a tragedy for mankind. Every man who does not live up to his highest possibilities is living in a state of sin. Mark Twain was, therefore, one of the chief of sinners, because his possibilities were so great and he fell so short. Every one knows that Mark Twain was a pessimist. During his later years he shouted out his pessimism to the four winds of heaven. I have no quarrel with a philosophical pessimist. Every honest man must report external life and his own consciousness as he sees and feels it. Jonathan Swift was a sincere pessimist. He kept his birthday as a day of fasting and mourning. Schopenhauer was a true pessimist, writing his greatest book before he was 30 years old. Thomas Hardy has always been a pessimist, both in youth and old age. These three men are all masters in literature, not because of their pessimism, but because of their literary art. It is a common error to suppose that pessimism in itself is a sign of profound thought, and optimism the mark of a shallow mind, just as many people when listening to music think they can look intelligent merely by looking sad. Emerson and Browning were both profound thinkers, and they were both incorrigible optimists. In a moment I shall give Mr. Brooks' reason why Mark Twain was a pessimist. I do not think it is the true explanation. I believe that Mark Twain's pessimism was partly a pose, and therefore to that extent unworthy of him. It was a creed by which he talked and wrote, not by which he lived. He railed at happiness, he railed at virtue, he railed at self-sacrifice, but he lived a wonderfully happy life. He was so virtuous that he could not swallow the GORKY episode, and he made immense sacrifices for an almost quixotic standard of honor and probity. No man was kinder or more generous in public or in private affairs. There is something unworthy about his contempt for the great unspeakable gift of life. When I remember his rise from obscurity to fame, the long years of dazzling popularity which he loved, the serene happiness of his family life, the idolatry of hosts of friends, and his statement that it was far better not to be born, I can only think of many individuals I know living in poverty and obscurity, without fame, riches, or popularity, shaken by appalling disasters, yet standing erect with cheerful, smiling courage. There is nothing heroic about Mark Twain's pessimism. On the 14th page Mr. Brooks states his hypothesis. No, there was a reason for Mark Twain's pessimism, a reason for that chagrin, that fear of solitude, that tortured conscience, those fantastic self accusations, that indubitable self contempt. It is an established fact, if I am not mistaken, that these morbid feelings of sin, which have no evident cause, are the result of having transgressed some inalienable life demand peculiar to one's nature. It is as old as Milton that there are talents which are death to hide, and I suggest that Mark Twain's talent was just so hidden. That bitterness of his was the effect of a certain miscarriage in his creative life, a balked personality, an arrested development of which he was himself almost wholly unaware, but which for him destroyed the meaning of life. The spirit of the artist in him, like the genie at last released from the bottle, overspread in a gloomy vapor the mind it had never quite been able to possess. If I understand Mr. Brooks correctly, there were two villains in Mark Twain's tragedy, his mother and his wife. His mother was more eager to have him good than to have him great. His wife wanted him to be a gentleman. Between them they tamed the lion and made him perform parlor tricks. This hypothesis is worked out by Mr. Brooks with such ingenuity and such force that I can only advise every one to read the whole book with serious attention to every page. Yet, although there is much truth in this explanation, I do not believe it to be the whole truth nor the real reason for Mark Twain's pessimism. Every man of genius who lives in organized society and has a wife and children must necessarily make some sacrifices. He cannot be free. He is checked by 1,000 hindrances. But do these repressions necessarily bring pessimism, or even unhappiness? Do we not often find pessimism in the absolute free life of an artist? Turgenev was as free as man can possibly be in this world. He was, it is true, subject to the caprices of Madame Viardot, so far as keeping social engagements went. But she never interfered with his creative life, and he realized his highest possibilities as an artist. What did he say? He said, "I would give all my fame if there were some woman who cared whether I came home late to dinner or not." Ibsen was married, but his wife has as much repressing effect on his artistic advance as a feather in the path of a locomotive. What did Ibsen say at the end of his marvelously successful career? He said, "It takes more courage to live than die." And in that last terrible drama, When We Dead Awaken, he tells us that the man who sacrifices love for art commits the one unpardonable sin. I do not believe that Mark Twain would have been happier if he had completely shaken off his mother's influence, or if he had trampled on his wife's sensibilities. If he really were dissatisfied with his achievements, however unconscious that discontent may have been, this was not, I think, owing to the restrictions placed on him by his conventional wife. It was owing to the natural self-reproach in every honest man, and particularly in those in whom the sense of humor is dominant. Humor and self-criticism go together. A sense of humor is an antidote for conceit. Mr. Brooks hints that Victor Hugo would never have consented to follow the advice of friends as Mark Twain did. But Victor Hugo had no sense of humor, and the complacency with which he looked back upon his career arose from a conceit that was even more colossal than his genius. Late in life some of his friends were talking with him and, of course, about him. One said, "Streets ought to be named after him." Another remarked, "Streets? Paris ought to change its name and be called Victor Hugo." Another added scornfully, "Paris? Paris after such a great man? No, indeed. France ought to change its name, and the whole country be called Victor Hugo." The great writer then lifted his head and with Jovian dignity spoke in tones of quiet, solemn conviction, "That will come in time." Mr. Brooks cannot sufficiently condemn the influence of Mrs. Clemens and the influence of Elmira, But it is worth remembering that Huckleberry Finn, which I am glad to say Mr. Brooks believes to be his masterpiece, was written during the crowded years of his married life, and much of it was written in Elmira. I have visited the lonely octagonal room in Elmira where Mark Twain wrote. It is an isolated little building on a hilltop, commanding an enormous view of rolling country. Here no one was allowed to disturb him. As a rule, he ate no luncheon. He went to this solitude after breakfast, and often remained there until evening. His wife kept visitors from him, looked after the household, and left him free. In Hartford his writing room was the upper story of the barn. There again he worked in undisturbed seclusion. She may have combed many things out of his manuscripts. She may have liked The Prince and the Pauper better than Huckleberry Finn. She had no genius, but the inspiration of love may have been as valuable to him as the inspiration of an artistic sense equal to his own. I do not believe that he was a fellow almost damned in a fair wife. Mr. Brooks, though he does not use this particular comparison, would have us imagine that his plight was almost equal to that of Andrea del Sarto, who looked from the bondage of domestic tyranny with longing at the great three, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci, who never let a woman come between them and their work. I can hardly subscribe to this. The fact that Mark Twain showed such sympathy with Huck's rebellion against the artificialities and restraints of polite society is nothing more than what all men and women too often feel, an instinctive resistance to convention that draws people at times away from the comforts of civilization into the free life of the woods. This feeling is in every human animal. Tolstoy is frequently quoted by Mr. Brooks with approval as a man who refused to surrender to society and remained a rebel to the last. But Tolstoy despised his best books, and looked upon Anna Karenina with loathing and contempt. If Mark Twain originally believed Joan of Arc to be a greater book than Huckleberry Finn, he found out later that it was not, and the judgments of authors about their own works are often strange. Thomas Hardy firmly believes that his poems are much greater than The Return of the Native and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I do not care what he thinks as long as we have his masterpieces of fiction. Mr. Brooks has written a powerful, thoughtful, and ingenious work, but he has endeavored to fit Mark Twain's life and career to a theory, and though he brings many facts and many strong arguments to its support, he fails because no man's life can be made to fit a theory. That Mark Twain wrote many books unworthy of his genius is perfectly true. So did Shakespeare. But not only do I think that Mr. Brooks has hit upon the wrong theory for the tragedy of Mark Twain's life, I do not think it was a tragedy. The fact that he loved the cultivated society of New England is no more against him than Shakespeare's love of the aristocrats, and his desire to become a gentleman can be thought a crime against his art. I do not believe that his mother or his wife or Mr. Howells inflicted any serious or permanent injury upon him, and whatever they may have done to repress him was perhaps equaled by the inspiration they all three undoubtedly gave him, the inspiration of love and friendship. A good case can be made against them for individual words and phrases they persuaded him to cut out of his writings, but these are matter for smiles than grief. They do not estop his genius. If he had been a great thinker like Goethe, he would not have held to so shallow a pessimism. But he was never a great thinker. He was a great novelist, a great humorist, a great artist. Goethe said of Byron, "The moment he thinks, he is a child." But he had a consuming admiration for Byron's genius. So, when I read What Is Man and Is Shakespeare Dead, I feel that an ignorant child is talking. But when I read Huckleberry Finn and Life on the Mississippi, I stand in awe before the mysterious power of genius. I agree with Mr. Brooks that Mark Twain did not realize all his highest possibilities, but I do not share his approval of Henry James' statement that Mark Twain's appeal is an appeal to rudimentary minds, nor of Arnold Bennett's calling him a divine amateur, and his remark that while Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer are episodically magnificent, as complete works of art they are of quite inferior quality. With all due respect to Arnold Bennett, his criticism of Mark Twain is an impertinence. This book was written before the appearance of the Letters of Henry James, but one thinks of those wonderful letters while reading Mr. Brooks. There was a man who did live up to his highest possibilities as an artist, who sought only an environment favorable to art, who lived away from his country, away from his family, and who was never married, whose passion was to do his best. But is it not at least possible that in a more normal life the genius of Henry James, splendid as we know it to be, might have been mellowed and enriched, more warm with humanity? It is vain to speculate on what might have been. Let us be grateful for genius wherever we find it. I believe that Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, Life on the Mississippi, Pudd'nhead Wilson, yes, and Innocents Abroad, are all great achievements. Whether one agrees with Mr. Brooks' thesis or not, and I do not, one must admire and one ought to profit by the noble and splendid purpose animating it. It is a call to every writer and to every man and woman not to sin against their own talents. End of Section 7, June 27, 1920. Mark Twain, Chief of Sinners, by William Lyon Phelps. Read by John Greenman. Section 8 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. September 12, 1920. Mark Twain's mock trial. We were having a very dull voyage. Mark Twain was one of the passengers on the steamship, and it was decided to have a mock trial instead of the usual concert for the benefit of the Seamen's Fund. Mark Twain was to be arrested and tried on the charge of being the greatest liar in the world. Everyone was eager for this unusual form of entertainment, and Mr. Clemens entered into the spirit of it heartily. Judge Dittenhofer, of New York, presided. A number of Harvard and Yale students were the jury, and the witnesses were other passengers. The hall was crowded. Everyone received a souvenir program with Mark Twain's autograph. The prisoner was handcuffed and forcibly led in by two sailors, looking as if he had had a severe struggle before his arrest. He was placed on the stand, and the witnesses talked about everything but the case. They related numerous funny stories, and the only allusion to Mark Twain's veracity was made by a witness who said Mark Twain had written that coffee in Germany was so weak that it looked and tasted as if a coffee bean had just waded through it, and she knew this to be untrue, since she had often tasted good coffee in Germany. Finally, the author testified in his own behalf, and said the only difference between others and himself was that other people were natural-born liars, while with him it was an acquired art. However, the jury found him guilty, and Judge Dittenhofer, in summing up the case, said he hoped Mark Twain would live long to charm us with his stories. The sentence was that he must read his own works 3 hours daily, whereupon Mark Twain, in weeping voice, said, "I would rather be hanged," and handed the jury 12 stolen napkins to weep with him. He made a picturesque figure with his shaggy white hair, his wonderfully brilliant eyes, and commanding presence. The receipts from the entertainment were $100. Carrie H. German. End of Section 8, September 12, 1920. Mark Twain's mock trial. Read by John Greenman. Section 9 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. This edited article contains only the portion relating to Mark Twain. November 7, 1920. Elect Mark Twain to Hall of Fame. 5 other men and Alice Freeman Palmer placed among American immortals. Patrick Henry recognized. Roger Williams, St. Gaudens, and the discoverer of anesthesia honored. Many notables voted for. Grover Cleveland and Martha Washington among those who fail of election. The report of the official canvass of ballots received from the electors of the Hall of Fame in the 5th quinquennial election was made public yesterday by the Senate of the University of the State of New York, disclosing that Mark Twain had been placed among the American immortals. In the absence of Dr. Robert Underwood Johnson, ambassador to Italy, the election was in charge of Mrs. William Vanamy as acting director. The names of 177 men were voted for, the 6 following being chosen: Samuel Langhorne Clemens, James Buchanan Eads, Patrick Henry, William Thomas Green Morton, Augustus St. Gaudens, and Roger Williams. 27 women were nominated, the successful candidate being Alice Freeman Palmer. Among those who received votes but not enough to elect were Noah Webster, Walt Whitman, Edward Everett Hale, John Brown, Henry M. Stanley, John Paul Jones, Philip Henry Sheridan, William Maxwell Evarts, Grover Cleveland, John Jay, William Penn, Edwin Booth, Joseph Jefferson, James A. McNeill Whistler, Susan B. Anthony, Martha Washington, and Pocahontas Rolfe. Louisa May Alcott was an unsuccessful candidate, as were Joel Chandler Harris, Cyrus Hall McCormick, John Erickson, John Hay, Theodore Thomas, Alice Carey, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The Hall of Fame Electorate. The electorate of the Hall of Fame consists of 96 men and 6 women. In the election just closed, the electors were university and college presidents, 27, professors of history and historians, 18, scientists, 11, authors and editors, 14, public officials and men and women of affairs, 19, past and present justices of national or state courts, 12. One elector cast a blank ballot. Biographical material prepared by the Hall of Fame concerning the new elected is as follows: Samuel Langhorne Clemens, American humorist, is more generally known by his pseudonym Mark Twain. He was born in Florida, Missouri, November 30, 1835, and died in Redding, Connecticut, April 21, 1910. After a brief schooling he was apprenticed to a printer in 1848 and worked at this trade in Philadelphia, New York, and in the West. While he was a pilot on the Mississippi River he was greatly taken with the cry of the leadsman in taking soundings, and when he began writing he signed himself Mark Twain, the cry of the leadsman being "By the Mark, Twain." After leaving the Mississippi he tried mining in Nevada. In 1862 he edited a newspaper in Virginia City, but soon tired of that and went to San Francisco, where he was a newspaper reporter. For a time he edited a newspaper in Buffalo, but tired of this and settled in Hartford, Connecticut. In Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, conceded to be his best books, he appears as a master of humor and pathetic suggestion with a great creative genius. Among his better known works are The Innocents Abroad, Roughing It, The Gilded Age, Life on the Mississippi, A Yankee in the Court of King Arthur, Pudd'nhead Wilson, How to Tell a Story, Autobiography of Mark Twain, and The $30,000 Bequest. End of Section 9, November 7, 1920. Elect Mark Twain to the Hall of Fame. Read by John Greenman. Section 10 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Editorial on election to Hall of Fame. November 9, 1920. Fame. So Mark Twain has at last got into the Hall of Fame. Edgar Allan Poe was admitted in 1910, but Walt Whitman still lingers outside the mystic enclosure within which sit the honored figures of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, and William Cullen Bryant. It may be argued, and doubtless has been, for few forms of error have the virtue of novelty, that fame and merit are not the same thing. He who is called the greatest of American poets is understood and appreciated abroad, though his own people have failed to live up to his somewhat optimistic prophecies. But so long as he is under moral disapproval here at home, no amount of foreign favor will suffice to mark him as famous. Fame is a local matter. A man's place in history may depend on the estimate of his unsuccessful neighbors in his home town. But Whitman's exclusion can no longer be defended by this argument, for by this time Whitman is pretty widely appreciated at home as well as in foreign parts, where some of the most distinguished American mediocrities have never been heard of. Whitman was a great writer, and he has become famous, but that is not enough to get him into the Hall of Fame. Poe was let in after a period of probation, but then Poe's writings were respectable. His life was not always commendable, but neither were the lives of some of the founders of this republic who were admitted virtually by acclamation. The difference is merely one of emphasis. We permit our famous men to overstep the bounds of conventionality, provided they do it apologetically, and without putting anything down on paper which may seem to suggest extenuation for their behavior. Perhaps Whitman would have been more fortunate if he had lived in our day. End of Section 10, November 9, 1920. Fame. Read by John Greenman. Section 11 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. November 24, 1920. To honor Mark Twain. Ettinger wants books mentioned in schools on author's birthday. City Superintendent of Schools Ettinger has notified district superintendents and principals that as November 30th will be the 85th anniversary of the birth of Mark Twain, Samuel L. Clemens, the attention of pupils, especially of those in the upper grades, ought to be directed to such books as Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and The Prince and the Pauper. He says that it might also be worth while to mention that the last named story has been dramatized and is now being produced in this city. I understand, he says, that the production is notable, both from the standpoint of the actors concerned and the historical correctness of the scenery and costumes. End of Section 11, November 24, 1920. To honor Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. Section 12 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 1, 1920. Observe Twain's birthday. Senator Reed extols author of The Prince and the Pauper at theater. The 85th anniversary of Mark Twain's birth was the occasion of a celebration last night at the Booth Theater, where a dramatization of the Twain story The Prince and the Pauper is being played. Following the second act, William Faversham introduced James A. Reed, senator from Missouri, Mark Twain's native state, and also read tributes from Secretary Lansing, Booth Tarkington, Mayor Hylan, John Grier Hibben, and others. "Mark Twain gave us pleasing fancies," said Senator Reed, "but he also gave to America and the world one of the most direct visions it had ever known. He saw instantly through sham and pretense of every sort.
Sometimes a nation deliberately deceives itself and worships its own delusion. Mark Twain, the American, was a caustic solvent for delusion. He was wholesome. We need his mentality in America today and in the world. He despised cant, and held the mirror of truth toward the countenance of hypocrisy. Twain hated kings and queens not for themselves, but for the false pretense they imposed on the earth.
End of Section 12, December 1st, 1920. Observe Twain's Birthday. Read by John Greenman. Section 13 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. March 10, 1921. Bust of Mark Twain stolen. Hartford, Connecticut, March 9th. Theft of a bust of Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, from in front of the former home of the author, was discovered here today. The pedestal of the bust was found in Park River, but no trace of the bust itself. A money reward has been offered for its return, as friends of the author consider it an excellent likeness. End of Section 13, March 10, 1921. Bust of Mark Twain stolen. Read by John Greenman. Section 14 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. October 9, 1921. Aid escape from Russia. Clara Clemens, Mark Twain's daughter, and her husband rescue his brothers. American money, pasted between the leaves of novels and between sheets of music, was responsible for my brother-in-law's release from Russia, where he had been practically a prisoner in his own apartment for the past 3 years, said Clara Clemens, daughter of Mark Twain, who, with her husband, Osip Gabrilowitsch, has just returned from a summer in Germany, Switzerland, England, and France. Miss Clemens, when seen at her apartment at 14 East 16th Street, seemed to be in excellent health and spirits. She has not, however, entirely recovered from a serious attack of influenza, which for some time has made her more or less of an invalid. My brother-in-law, George Gabrilowitsch, she said, arrived in Berlin just before we left that city, after a most frightful journey from Petrograd to Riga. He said that all but 2 rooms in his apartment had been seized by the Soviet government, that all his money had been taken from him, and that for nearly 3 years he had but 1 meal a day. His hair was almost white, although he is still young, and he was emaciated to a shadow of his former self. The trip from Petrograd to Riga was made in a train packed so full of people it was impossible for one of them to sit down unless they all sat down. Food, what little there was of it, was gathered along the way wherever the train stopped. This journey, which in the old days took but 24 hours, now takes more than 6 to 7 days. As he was not in sympathy with the Soviet government, he had been treated as any prisoner. He said it was impossible to describe the tyranny under which he and other non-sympathizers had lived. The people whose houses and money had been seized had 1 or 2 rooms to live in, 1 meal a day, and were allowed to go to walk only at certain hours. The fare, even before the famine made it impossible to get grain and other foods, was unspeakable. It was principally to get his 2 brothers out of Russia that my husband went to England this summer. In London he talked with Mr. Krassin, and while he was very helpful, in fact appeared anxious to help, and told my husband just how to send money into Russia, it somehow went astray before it reached its destination. We did not know just where it was lost. We never did know, but it was months before any money reached our 2 brothers. Finally we tried pasting bills in books, story books, and between sheets of music. Some of this got through, and some of it didn't. At least enough got through to bring them out. We have just received word that the second one has reached Riga. According to my brother-in-law, reports coming out of Russia are not exaggerated. There is no food, and there are no clothes. The people are tired of the present regime. What the next step will be no one seems to know. Life in Munich, where I spent several months the past year, is not as cheerful as it used to be in the old days. Every one goes to the opera, to be sure, just as they always have, but there is no gala dressing as before the war. Somehow one does not feel like wearing gay clothes in Munich. It just isn't done. There was one Bolshevist demonstration while I was there. We went out one morning and saw large placards pasted on all the billboards, warning people to keep off the streets at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as there would be a revolutionary demonstration. We went out at that hour, however, and there was a big crowd in the street, a boisterous crowd. The soldiers had been called out, and there were machine guns on most of the street corners. One man was killed and several wounded. Friends of mine who had been in Munich 2 years earlier, during the big revolution, when 2,000 persons were killed, did not think this one very serious. Many of the buildings still bear the bullet marks of the Civil War of 2 years ago. While the officials make it difficult to gain entry to Bavaria, many refugees from all parts of the world are there now: Poles, Hungarians, Russians, Bulgarians. They are a restless crowd. The returned soldier class is also a disturbing element. Today they want a democracy. Tomorrow they want another form of government, and so it goes. Our visit in Berlin was not interrupted by any similar demonstration. There things are much quieter, and life has resumed its old routine. A great friend of mine, Countess S., who had belonged to the court circles in Vienna and had saved a very little money, was living in Munich. We went to the opera often together. One evening she pointed out a quietly dressed gentleman sitting in one of the boxes, and said, "That is the ex Czar of Bulgaria." A few nights later we were late getting to the opera. After the curtain goes up one must always wait until the end of the act. They are very strict in Europe about this. No one is ever allowed to enter during an act. As this opera was a modern one, and this one a premiere, and there was but one act, we had visions of missing the whole of it, when the ex Czar of Bulgaria came along and, being a friend of the Countess, stopped and spoke to us. We told him our trouble, and he said he would see what he could do. In a few minutes he came back and took us into the opera house. Even ex-royalty still has its privileges in some places in Europe. Miss Clemens has gone to Detroit to join her husband, who is director of the symphony orchestra there. She plans to return to Munich in May and give a historical series of national songs. This series will embrace the history of the songs of all nations from the beginning to the present day. End of Section 14, October 9, 1921. Aid Escape from Russia. Read by John Greenman. Section 15 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by John Greenman. March 12, 1922. Mark Twain found Gorky a vexation. Hits public in the face with his hat, then holds it out, he wrote. 19 letters of Mark Twain to Charlotte Teller, the author of The Cage, will be sold at the Anderson Galleries on March 14th. Miss Teller met Mark Twain in connection with Gorky's visit to New York during the Russian Revolution of 1905. She saw him nearly every day for about 3 months. She then went abroad, and they continued to correspond at intervals until his death. In one of the letters Mark Twain says: "Gorky is a puzzle and a vexation to me. He came here in a distinctly diplomatic capacity, a function which demands and necessitates delicacy, tact, deference to people's prejudices. He came on a great mission, a majestic mission, the succor of an abused and suffering vast nation. As to his diplomacy, it does not resemble Talleyrand's, Gortchakov's, Metternich's. It is new,
It is original. It has not its like in history. He hits the public in the face with his hat, and then holds it out for contributions. It is not ludicrous, it is pitiful. As to his patriotism, his lofty talk of lifting up and healing his bleeding nation, it can't stand the strain of a trifling temporary inconvenience. He had made a grave blunder, and persistently refuses to rectify it. The other letters are full of such characteristic touches as, "I never use profanity except when writing to a clergyman. They have taken to interrupting me every time I try to arrange about my funeral, which is to be in January, a year and 7 months from now, January 4th. I tell strangers it is the 6th. This letter reminds me of the time I reformed. I said I would smoke only one cigar a day. Before the month was out I was getting cigars manufactured specially. They were as long as a crutch." In one of the letters he says, "If you yourself have any doubts, brush them away, for there is greatness in you, Charlotte, more than you suspect." A few of the letters have pieces cut out of them, which was done by Mark Twain, who explained it in this way: "This letter is getting oppressively long for you, who are a busy person, and I am modifying it with the scissors." The letters are sympathetic and intimate. They are full of revelations of character and conditions. In spite of their sometimes somber tone, they are full of humorous touches. End of Section 15, March 12, 1922. Mark Twain found Gorky a vexation. Read by John Greenman. Section 16 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. March 21, 1922. $200,000 Mark Twain set. Gabriel Wells pays record price for any author's work. Gabriel Wells, rare bookseller, has bought from P. F. Collier & Son Company a new definitive deluxe edition of Mark Twain's works, valued at more than $200,000. It is said to be the highest price ever paid for a single edition of any author's works. Mr. Clemens' estate will receive from this sale alone more money than the author of a bestseller of the day obtains from the sale of 100,000 copies. This royalty, added to the returns on the popular editions of Mark Twain, make his earnings, it is said, the greatest recorded for any author. The value of this edition is enhanced by autographed title pages done by Mr. Clemens a short time before his death. End of Section 16, March 21, 1922. $200,000 Mark Twain set. Read by John Greenman. Section 17 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. June 11, 1922. Twain's cabin dedicated. California quarters occupied by author when seeking gold restored. Sonora, California, June 10th. The Mark Twain Memorial Cabin at Jackass Hill near here was dedicated today, with Governor William D. Stevens delivering the dedicatory address. Twain slept and ate in the cabin, which has been restored, during the time he prospected for gold in California. He gave up prospecting and left this district in 1865. The governor recited events of Twain's arrival at Jackass Hill in December 1864, his prospecting days, and his life in the cabin,
which has been restored by William J. Loring, President of the American Mining Congress. The beginning of Twain's career of making men's tasks easier to bear, the Governor said, is indelibly associated with his days in the mining country of Tuolumne and Calaveras counties. In his cabin the sick were made well, and the well made better as the result of his cheerfulness and humor. End of section 17, June 11, 1922. Twain's Cabin Dedicated. Read by John Greenman. Section 18 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 28, 1922. Mark Twain's home sold. Mrs. Margaret Given becomes owner of humorous Connecticut estate. Reading, Connecticut, December 27th. Stormfield, the home of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, Mark Twain, on Reading Ridge, in which he spent the last years of his career until his death in 1910, will pass into the hands of Mrs. Margaret Given of New York City as the result of arrangements completed through the trustees of the humorist's estate, it was announced tonight. The estate, which consists of 248 acres of land and an Italian villa, was planned by Mark Twain as a country retreat. It has been unoccupied since his death and will be remodeled by its new owner. End of section 18, December 28, 1922. Mark Twain's home sold. Read by John Greenman. Section 19 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. This edited article contains only reference to Mark Twain. January 25, 1923. Pays $1,900 for rare Mark Twain work. Dr. Rosenbach buys manuscript at sale of Mrs. John B. Stansfield Library. Mark Twain's manuscript, Is Shakespeare Dead?, brought $1,900 yesterday at the sale in the Anderson Galleries of the library of Mrs. John B. Stansfield of Islip, Long Island. The afternoon session yielded $11,798.50, while the evening sales amounted to $8,762, making a total for the day of $20,560.50. The sale will be continued this afternoon and evening. Dr. A. S. W. Rosenbach, who has been one of the heaviest buyers at recent book sales, was the purchaser of the Mark Twain manuscript, which brought the highest price of the day. This is a desirable manuscript because autographed manuscripts of this period of Mark Twain's life are uncommon. During the later years of Mark Twain's literary activity, he generally resorted to stenographic dictation. This is one of his last in longhand. End of section 19, January 25, 1923. Pays $1,900 for rare Mark Twain work. Read by John Greenman. Section 20 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by John Greenman. March 23, 1923. Mark Twain estate sold. The trustees of the Samuel L. Clemens estate have sold Stormfield, near Reading, Connecticut, to Mrs. Margaret E. Given. The property contains about 200 acres, with a stucco residence of Italian architecture, containing 18 rooms and 5 baths, built in 1907, and occupied by Mr. Clemens, Mark Twain, the world-famous humorist, until his death in 1910. Hamilton, Iselin and Company were the brokers in the deal. End of section 20, March 23, 1923. Mark Twain estate sold. Read by John Greenman. Section 21 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. June 10, 1923. Dinner talk by Mark Twain. A review by Percy A. Hutchinson. Mark Twain's Speeches, edited by Albert Bigelow Paine, 396 pages, New York, Harper & Brothers, $2.25. In most respects, this edition of the speeches of Samuel L. Clemens is not a new book. Fully 90% of the speeches herein contained will be found in the earlier collection from the hands of the same editor. Moreover, that earlier collection contains more than a score of speeches not to be found in the later book. On the other hand, the new volume includes a considerable amount of material which was not in the first collection. Textually, the new book is more nearly authentic, and the fact that Albert Bigelow Paine has arranged the speeches chronologically makes possible for the first time a study of Mark Twain's growth and evolution as a lecturer and after-dinner speaker. This study will be found as illuminating as it is interesting. The earliest lecture of Mark Twain's of which Paine has been able to secure a manuscript copy was Clemens' talk on the Sandwich Islands, first delivered at Maguire's Music Hall, San Francisco, in October, 1866, and afterward repeated by Clemens many times, both in this country and in England. Previous to the initial delivery of this lecture, Mark Twain had spoken more than once in public, at least so his editor believes, but of these talks, which may have been extemporaneous, there is no text or report extant. Hence the speech-making career of the American humorist must be considered as having begun with the Sandwich Islands talk. Paine closes the volume with a short appreciation by Twain of William Travers Jerome, delivered at a dinner to the then district attorney held at Delmonico's in May, 1909. Thus the speech-making career of Mark Twain extended over a period of 43 years, during which time his humor held unfailing, although it underwent certain subtle changes, losing its boisterousness and acquiring a mellowness as time went on. Most notable is it that never, even when life bore most heavily on Clemens, is there the slightest trace of acerbity. Indeed, as the reader progresses through the book he finds the conviction forced upon him that Mark Twain held his sense and his command of humor as a very sacred thing, as a Pentecostal gift, to be used for healing, never to be used for wounding. Righteously indignant Clemens could be at times, and righteously indignant he was when the hypocrisies, shams, and abuses that were all around him seemed too great to bear, and on such occasions his wit was barbed. But after the shaft had found its mark he soothed with the curative touch of a mirth mingled with magnanimity, or turned from the subject with a jovial quip. Certain critics have made considerable ado latterly over the alleged discovery that underlying Twain's humor was a substratum of pessimism. It is apparently the conclusion of this school that Clemens was a modern Prometheus, who, finding no escape from the vulture tearing at his entrails, took refuge in making a colossal mock of his devourer. If this view be correct, there is little evidence of it in the speeches, where one would expect to find it most pronounced, and no evidence whatever in the earlier speeches. On the contrary, the impression one gets from Twain's earlier attempts to storm the lecture platform is that of a young man who has discovered that he is possessed of a certain rare talent, in this case the talent for humor, and who is making, now furtive, now arrogant, efforts to put his product across. And, far from anything of pessimism, there is, instead, all the joy of a puppy awkwardly learning to walk. If one can hear the laughter of the audience, one can also hear the chortle of the lecturer as the effect for which he planned comes off successfully. The information furnished by the editor that in the beginning Twain "carefully wrote out his speeches, learned them by heart, and practised them in seclusion," would have been guessed at by the reader. The lecture on the Sandwich Islands shows in every line and word the most careful preparation. It was evidently not only cast, but recast, and the trepidation of the speaker is at once apparent. Clemens felt that he must give a certain amount of information that bore on its face evidence that it was true, and on this information he depended to carry the speech through. Launching himself in medias res, he says:
To cut the matter short, the Sandwich Islands are 2,100 miles southwest from San Francisco, but why they were put out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so far from any place and in such an inconvenient locality, is no business of ours. It was the work of Providence, and not open to criticism.
The reader feels clearly the half hesitating manner in which Twain makes the transition from fact to humor, and not such robust humor at that; but it is enough to provoke a smile, if not a laugh, and after a little more of the same tentative wit, the lecturer again seeks the solid ground of fact before his next attempt at humor. But he had succeeded, as the reader of the speech in cold type finds himself faced to admit. The smile carries over, and when again the speaker essayed the humorous, this time with more confidence and more robustness, he was master of the situation. Not only is the lecture a valuable object of study for any one planning to attempt the career of humorist, but it is illuminating as a study of Mark Twain. The lecture on the subject of the Sandwich Islands bears witness in every line that a writer and speaker had come into his own. Very early in Twain's speech making two traits appear which became more pronounced as time went on. One of these was shrewdness. The other might be called egotism, but to call it egotism would be to do Clemens an injustice. It took the form of talking about himself, but of talking about himself in a humorous way. In the speech which the editor called unconscious plagiarism, delivered at the dinner given by the publishers of the Atlantic Monthly to Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1879, Twain says:
A certain amount of pride always goes along with a teaspoonful of brains, and that protects a man from stealing other people's ideas. That is what a teaspoonful of brains will do for a man, and admirers had often told me that I had nearly a basketful, though they were rather reserved as to the size of the basket.
Or again in the address at the Fourth of July dinner of the American Society in London 20 years later:
Consider the effect of a short residence here. I find the ambassador, Joseph Choate, rises first to speak to a toast, followed by a senator, and I come third. What a subtle tribute that to the monarchical influence of the country when you place rank above respectability.
Of course this egotism, or mock egotism, is indicative of the progress Twain had achieved in the affection of the people, not merely the American people, but Englishmen also. It would be an interesting experiment to place the volume of speeches before some reader who had never taken up a book of Twain's, who knew nothing of the humorist's place in literature, have him construct the man from this record of his spoken words. The picture would be more nearly true than most portraits, for Clemens gave of himself unsparingly, genuinely. As we get away from the lecture period and into the years when the speeches were invariably made in response to the toastmaster's call, Twain is more and more frankly himself, although it was his rule, after a momentary revelation, to turn the matter off with a quip. On these occasions he talked of his debts, his honor, his family, his hopes and his fears and his affections. But so nimble was he that before there was any slopping over into sentimentality he had snapped the whip, and his hearers, on the verge of a tear, were brought up with a laugh. Very rarely was there any exception to this. In the political speech against Blaine, Clemens was in too deadly earnest to trifle with humor, and when he replied to the toast at the dinner given him at Delmonico's on his 70th birthday by Colonel Harvey, he finished without the customary joke at the end. The close of the 70th birthday speech has no counterpart in American literature, and the only Britisher who could have come near it would have been Stevenson, and Stevenson could not have done it in so consummate a fashion. Twain led up to his closing with a fine burst of buffoonery. It was not such good buffoonery as he had mustered in his younger days, but it served his purpose, which was to get his hearers into such a state of laughter that they would not grasp the fact that he had turned to seriousness until he was halfway through. Apparently launched into verbal clowning that had no end in sight, Twain suddenly switched. 60 years and 10! It is the scriptural statute of limitations, and after that you have no active duties. You are a time expired man, to use Kipling's military phrase. You have served your time, well or ill, and you are mustered out. Blank. If you shrink at the thought of night and winter and the late homecoming from the banquet and the lights and laughter through the deserted streets, a desolation which would not remind you now, as for a generation it did, that your friends are sleeping, and you must creep in a tiptoe and not disturb them, but would only remind you that you need not tiptoe. You can never disturb them more. If you shrink at the thought of these things, you need not make in declining an invitation the previous engagement plea. You need only reply, "Your invitation honors me and pleases me because you still keep me in your remembrance, but I am 70, and would nestle in the chimney corner and smoke my pipe and read my book and take my rest, and then when you in your turn shall arrive at Pier Number 70, you may step aboard your waiting ship with a reconciled spirit, and lay your course toward the sinking sun with a contented heart." This also should go a long way to refute the pessimist charge. It is true that Mark Twain was no superficial optimist. He was a staunch moralist, a teacher in cap and bells, almost a preacher. But he delighted in his humor, and even if he had his moments of melancholy such moments are evidenced more than once he was no pessimist. One cannot leave the subject of Mark Twain's speeches without recurring to what he must have looked back upon as the most ludicrous happening of his career, although at the time it seemed anything but ludicrous. The story is told in the Twain biography, and will be familiar to most of Twain's readers. Reference is made to the Whittier dinner in Boston in 1877, at which Clemens unintentionally wounded the susceptibilities of Boston's literary inhabitants, hero worshiping at the names of Longfellow, Emerson, and Holmes. In his broadest but never gross frontier style and manner, Twain elaborated an extravagant fiction of having arrived at a miner's cabin and asked shelter for the night, seeking to get on the right side of the miner by impressing him with the fact that his caller was none less than Mark Twain. The prospector, however, instead of being impressed, allowed that he wanted no more literary fellows around, three having stopped there the night before and mussed up things generally, ending with a fight. On Twain's inquiry as to the identity of the strangers, they turned out to be the trinity named. The speech was received in utter silence. Clemens had quoted from the poetry of each, and made, it is true, a ridiculous application of the passage quoted. For example, the three are represented as playing euchre. "I began," says the miner, "to notice some pretty suspicious things. Mr. Emerson dealt, looked at his hand, shook his head, says, 'I am the doubter and the doubt,' and calmly bunched the hands and went to shuffling for a new layout. Says he, 'They reckon ill who leave me out. They know not well the subtle ways I keep. I pass and deal again.'" Twain's other quotations were similarly applied, and the very exaggeration of the humor should have been sufficient to carry the absurdity across. But no. Even W. D. Howells, who, as toastmaster, had introduced the humorist, was unable to smooth matters out. Twain was stunned. Speaking of the incident later, he said: "The people in front of me seemed to turn to stone with horror. It was the sort of expression their faces would have worn if I had been making these remarks about the Deity and the rest of the Trinity. There is no other way in which to describe the petrified condition and ghastly expression of those people." It took many letters of apology before Clemens was able to set himself right, and he never tried again the experiment of lampooning an idol of the Boston Brahmins. But the episode shows that we of this generation hardly realize how seriously America's Victorians took themselves. But some of the Brahmins of the idols of our present Georgian period would undoubtedly make a similar spectacle of themselves if some Mark Twain should open the windows on their pretensions and let in the fresh wind of humor and common sense. End of Section 21, June 10, 1923. Dinner Talk by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. Section 22 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. July 9, 1923. HARBAUGH, writer of terror tales, sells relics of past to pay way in poorhouse. Casstown, Ohio, July 8. Associated Press. Before a small collection of worldly goods stood a village auctioneer, importuning a handful of country people to part with their dollars, thus starting the last chapter in the life of Thomas C. Harbaugh, as fantastic an ending, probably, as he ever dreamed of when he was penning vivid fiction 80 years ago. Not very valuable looking were these real possessions of Harbaugh, and they brought but $1,000, but they were rich in names and associations. In an autograph book, which sold for $60, was a letter from Mark Twain to Governor Frank Fuller of New York, dated in 1870 at Hartford, Connecticut, which said: "My dear Fuller, does the whiskey mill need a new man who knows how to boss men? I know the right man, in case a boss should be wanted. Diligent, honest, and plucky, never drinks, but can be taught." The letter was signed Mark. Harbaugh, now nearing his 80th birthday, whose name was on the lips of readers of the American Penny Dreadfuls, was on his way to Miami County Infirmary today, the poorhouse, as most people call it, with the $1,000, which he expects will keep him there as a paying inmate for the rest of his life. In the days of Beadle's Dime Weekly, the Saturday Night, and such publications, the name of Thomas C. Harbaugh was seen in many issues over a story of blood-curdling adventure, evolved from a prolific mind in somnolent and peaceful Casstown. His name and that of Nick Carter often were linked together as writers of a kind. Volumes of sensational writing were turned out by Harbaugh, and at one time he was considered wealthy from the returns of his endeavors. There are many stories in Casstown of how he scattered the money. The autograph book contains scores of letters from eminent Americans, from Abraham Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt. His correspondence also included many Union and Confederate generals who survived the Civil War, as well as foreign notables who acknowledged over their signatures the pleasure they had found either in his thrilling stories or the sentimental poetry that he wrote in reams. End of Section 22, July 9, 1923. Harbaugh, writer of terror tales, sells relics of past to pay way in poorhouse. Read by John Greenman. Section 23, Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. July 26, 1923. Twain's old home destroyed by fire. Stormfield at Redding, Connecticut, burns. Present owners flee for lives. Redding, Connecticut, July 25th. Stormfield, the home of Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, in the closing years of his life, was burned early today. The picturesque villa on the ridge of this town was unoccupied for many years after Mr. Clemens's death, but was bought in December by Mrs. Margaret E. Givens of New York as a summer home. The home was built to carry out the ideas and wishes of Mr. Clemens, and with the other buildings comprised a country estate. In this home Mark Twain spent his last years, and as he had expressed it, experienced some of the deepest sorrows of his life, as well as some of his happiest days. Here his younger daughter, Janet, met a tragic death, and here there was a burglary which aroused widespread interest. In Stormfield Mr. Clemens lay ill for a long time, and from it his body was borne to its last resting place. After a visit to Stormfield, William Dean Howells wrote of Mark Twain in his home: "He showed his absolute content with his home. Truly he loved the place." Mrs. Givens, her daughter Thelma, and her son Eben were in the house when the latter discovered the fire in the laundry. They were obliged to flee in their night garments. The flames could be seen for a long distance, and farmers hastened to the place to assist the Redding Fire Department and neighbors. The property was originally offered at $175,000, and the house was valued at a considerable part of that figure. It was insured. The fire is believed to have started from spontaneous combustion among some painting materials which were in the laundry. Neighbors saved a few things, including articles which had been thought much of by Mr. Clemens. Among them was a carved mantel brought by him from Scotland. End of Section 23, July 26, 1923. Twain's old home destroyed by fire. Read by John Greenman. Section 24 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. October 7, 1923. A book review. Europe and Elsewhere. Europe and Elsewhere by Mark Twain, with an appreciation by Brander Matthews and an introduction by Albert Bigelow Paine. Frontispiece from drawing by Peter Newell, 406 pages, New York, Harper & Brothers, $2.25. Old-timers, very old-timers, in newspaperdom out in Nevada and California still chuckle over a story they heard a generation and more ago from Mark Twain's associates on the Virginia City Enterprise when he was doing his prenticeship on that paper soon after the Civil War. It was the custom, they explain, in those unregenerate days, whenever a new saloon was opened, which was quite frequently, for Virginia City was in its heyday of mining prosperity and life was hectic and hilarious, for the proprietors to send a basket of champagne to the newspaper office, expecting, and always receiving, in the next issue an account of the occasion and the place that glowed with good fellowship. Such a basket, large and well filled, came one day, and to young Clemens was assigned the job of writing the story about it. The others heard him laughing to himself now and then as he wrote, and when he hung his copy on the hook and hurried off on some other assignment, for the office was undermanned and he did all manner of varied work. They read it, laughing uproariously. He had written it as if under the mounting inspiration of bottle after bottle of the wine, not one of which had been opened, mingling boisterous humor, sly wit, quaint fantasy, extravagant imagination, and seeming to progress gradually through the successive stages of intoxication from brilliant good fellowship at the beginning through increasing mental stuttering and hiccuping to sudden end in maudlin imbecility. They agreed it was a masterpiece of its kind and excruciatingly funny, and hailed Clemens on his return with congratulations and appreciation. But when the paper came out his "story" wasn't there, and in its place was a colorless, conventional 4-line notice. Clemens and his associates rushed in a body to the composing room to find out what had happened. The foreman explained. "Yes, I read the piece, and I saw Sam had been getting drunk again, and I was afraid the boss would discharge him if he saw the proof of it in the paper. So I threw it away and wrote that item instead, and I reckon I saved Sam's job for him." To this day the old timers declare that it was the funniest and cleverest and most brilliant thing Mark Twain ever wrote, and hold that he thought so too, and always regretted its untimely snuffing out. One closes this new posthumous volume with the wish that somebody as strenuously determined as Mark Twain's old foreman to uphold his reputation to its highest notch had taken a hand in the selection of the papers that compose it. Some of them, indeed, are well worth while. The initial article, describing a visit to Westminster Abbey at midnight, any lover of Mark Twain ought to read. Mr. Paine tells us in his introduction that it was part of a mass of notes, comments, and short bits that Twain wrote during a visit to England in 1872, as preparation for a book about that country. But he gave up that purpose and the volume was never written. Other articles preserve newspaper correspondence from Europe during the '70s and the '90s. There are some graphic descriptions of scenes, incidents, and places, one of these telling the story of a lazy, drifting trip down the Rhone River in 1891, of which some parts are very delightful, while others are unworthy of Mark Twain or anyone else. It was on this trip that he discovered and lost a mountain silhouette having a startling resemblance to a recumbent Napoleon of tremendous size, which is described in another short article. Readers of one of Albert Bigelow Paine's recent books will remember the account of an automobile journey he took through that country in 1913 for the purpose, which was finally successful, of rediscovering that effigy. The volume contains 35 articles of varying length, dated all along through the years from the early '70s to 1908. Some of them had newspaper or magazine publication at the time, but most of them are now put into print for the first time. Some deserve preservation because of their inherent worth and their delectable, inimitable Mark Twain flavor, but as for most of them, it is probable that the author had entirely forgotten them and would have rushed them into the wastebasket if he had known they would sometime appear in print. End of Section 24, October 7, 1923. Europe and Elsewhere. Read by John Greenman. Section 25 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. This is an edited segment from the original article. December 2, 1923. Fleet-fingered typist, the deus ex machina of the 20th century and her forerunners, by Mary Badger Wilson. It was in 1867 that Christopher Latham Sholes made his first crude writing machine, which he himself christened typewriter, and by 1873 he had so far perfected the instrument that the Remington firm of gun makers undertook to market it. There are still in existence copies of one of the original catalogs, a quaint publication containing the following testimonial from Mark Twain: Hartford, March 19,
1875. Gentlemen, please do not use my name in any way. Please do not even divulge the fact that I own a machine. I have entirely stopped using the typewriter for the reason that I never could write a letter with it to anybody without receiving a request by return mail that I would not only describe the machine, but state what progress I had made in the use of it, etc., etc. I don't like to write letters, and so I don't want people to know that I own this curiosity breeding little joker. Yours truly, Samuel L. Clemens.
The first typed manuscript ever submitted to a publisher was one of Mark Twain's masterpieces. End of Section 25, December 2, 1923, Fleet-Fingered Typist. Read by John Greenman. Section 26 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. April 18, 1924. Buys Mark Twain's house. G. L. Hunter is reported acting for a wealthy New Yorker. Reading, Connecticut, April 17th. The Mark Twain place, where stand the ruins of the former home of the author, burned 3 years ago, has been sold to George Leland Hunter, who, it is understood, represents a wealthy New York man who is expected to erect an elaborate residence on the site. Mr. Hunter recently purchased and occupies the house known as the Lobster Pot, given by Mark Twain to his social secretary, Miss Virginia Lyon. He is author of several books on tapestries. End of Section 26, April 18, 1924. Buys Mark Twain's house. Read by John Greenman. Section 27 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. May 14, 1924. Unveiled 10 busts for Hall of Fame. 9 men and 1 woman further honored at ceremonies at New York University. Trumpeters lead parade. Tributes paid to Adams, Brooks, Clemens, Eads, Cooper, Jefferson, Alice Palmer, and others. 10 of the immortals in the Hall of Fame were further honored yesterday when the busts of 9 men and 1 woman, leaders in statesmanship, in science, in letters, in medicine, in education, and in religion, were presented and unveiled with impressive ceremonies at New York University. Descendants, in several cases, unveiled the busts, and men of eminence in the branches in which they excelled told why they merited places among the immortals. The ceremonies were held in a large marquee pitched on the lawn outside the Hall of Fame, and those who were honored were John Adams, President of the United States, Bishop Phillips Brooks, Samuel L. Clemens, James Buchanan Eads, engineer, Peter Cooper, also an engineer and founder of Cooper Union, Joseph Henry, Alice Freeman Palmer, who at the age of 26 was president of Wellesley College, Andrew Jackson, soldier and statesman, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, and Dr. W. T. G. Morton, pioneer in anesthesia. Their busts, wrought in bronze, hidden at first from view by enfolding American flags, were placed in a colonnade of whitened classic pillars, and were unveiled in turn. Dr. Robert Underwood Johnson, poet and editor, director of the Hall of Fame, presided, and Dr. Elmer Ellsworth Brown, chancellor of the university, stood beside him. An active participant in the ceremonies was Thomas A. Edison, who caused some amusement at first by moving whenever photographers had him in focus, but he would not let them snap him until it fell to him to unveil the bust of Joseph Henry. Then he stood still for a moment, and the troubles of the photographers were over. Procession opens ceremonies. The ceremonies opened with a procession of the faculty of the university and invited guests, which formed in the rotunda of the library, and, led by 4 women trumpeters, in classic attire and carrying a colorful array of flags, passed slowly through the open corridor of the Hall of Fame, past the busts already there. The audience of nearly 500 persons rose when the trumpeters led the way into the marquee. Then, one by one, the busts were unveiled. First came John Adams, and another John Adams, the great-great-grandson of the first, unveiled the bust, but not before Dr. Johnson said that in the selections to the Hall of Fame there was no room for race, sex, religious, or political opinion. "The Hall of Fame," he said, "is not a calendar of saints, but of human beings, each of whom presents some fine equation of greatness. It is not too much to say that the names here recorded and those to be added will be for all time the pride and inspiration of the American people." The address on John Adams was by William M. Sloane, president of the Academy of Arts and Letters. He said Adams had been justly designated as a self-made aristocrat, and that he exhibited a towering moral courage in successfully defending British soldiers charged with murder in the Boston Massacre at a time when public opinion was dangerously inflamed. The bust of Phillips Brooks was by Daniel Chester French and was the gift of Trinity Church, Boston, members of whose vestry attended. It was unveiled by Miss Josephine Brooks, a niece. Mark Twain's daughter there. Mrs. Ossip Gabrilowitsch, daughter of Samuel L. Clemens, unveiled the bust of Mark Twain. Miss Agnes Repplier made the address. She said Mark Twain had been aptly described as America's great laughing philosopher, but that his hatred of sham raised him to the status of moralist. Governor Arthur M. Hyde of Missouri and Bainbridge Colby, president of the Missouri Society, were in the delegation that escorted James Eads Switzer, a grandson, to unveil the bust of James Buchanan Eads, and Dr. George F. Swain, professor of civil engineering at Harvard University, made the address. The bust of Peter Cooper, the work of Chester Beach, was presented in behalf of graduates of Cooper Union, and was unveiled by Miss Edith Cram, a great-great-granddaughter. R. Fulton Cutting made the address. A delegation of Barnard girls escorted Professor George H. Palmer of Harvard University to unveil the bust of his wife, Alice Freeman Palmer. The address was by Dr. James A. Angle, president of Yale University. Members of the Ladies' Hermitage Association of Nashville, Tennessee, unveiled the bust of Andrew Jackson, which was presented by the association. Albert Marble Jackson, a great-grandson, unveiled the memorial, and Norman H. Davis, former acting Secretary of State, spoke. The bust of Thomas Jefferson was unveiled by Mrs. Frances O. Barton, a great-great-granddaughter, and was provided through subscriptions raised by the New York World. Dr. Edwin A. Alderman, president of the University of Virginia, which Jefferson founded, spoke of him as the first great philosopher and intellectual radical in American life. The bust of Dr. William T. G. Morton, anesthetist, was unveiled by Bowditch Morton, a grandson. Dr. William W. Keene, a former president of the American Surgical Association, made the address. Thomas A. Edison unveiled the bust of Joseph Henry, electrical engineer, and Frank B. Jewett, a former president of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, made the address. The busts will be placed on their pedestals in the Hall of Fame today. End of section 27. May 14, 1924. Unveil 10 busts for Hall of Fame. Read by John Greenman. Section 28 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. July 13, 1924. Mark Twain's Broad German Grin. New translations have helped to restore a lost sense of humor. By Ulrich Steindorf.
I remember my first college vacations, when I went to Berlin to see my grandmother. She was then in her 70s, a wise old lady, never without some book she lived in and talked about. I talked about Whitman, but she smiled, opened the book she had in her lap, looked over her glasses, and asked me, "Do you know Mark Twain?" It was one of his sketches she read to me, and from that very hour Mark Twain has been my mentor. I had not known Mark Twain's stories before that time. He had his following in Germany as everywhere, but his works had never had the popularity they deserved. People read his sketches, knew particularly the German parts of A Tramp Abroad. In every library there was Tom Sawyer, and there was also Huckleberry Finn, but they did not mean anything to the youth. Mark Twain says in his preface to Tom Sawyer, "Although my book is intended mainly for the entertainment of boys and girls, I hope it will not be shunned by men and women on that account, for part of my plan has been to try pleasantly to remind adults of what they once were themselves, and of how they felt and thought and talked, and what queer enterprises they sometimes engaged in." German adults never did shun these books, but German boys and girls were not their readers. 10 years after my first acquaintance with Mark Twain's sketches, I read his Tom Sawyer first in English. It was in the year of 1912, the same year in which my first translation, Kipling's Plain Tales, appeared. Now for the first time I understood why Mark Twain had not acquired a true popularity. "Translation is always a treason," says Okakuro Kakuzo in his Book of Tea, quoting the observance of a Ming author, "and can at its best be only the reverse side of a brocade. All the threads are there, but not the subtlety of color or design." Aside from the fact that the German translations of Mark Twain's works missed many threads he had woven together, and that the original color of his humor had faded and the subtle design had been reversed into mere caricature, time was against the American classic. Average German adults of that period, grounded in veneration for monarchism, were unable to appreciate the gospel of democracy. They either would or could not understand Mark Twain's smiling philosophy, or his satiric mockery, or his relieving laughter. And in keeping with that attitude, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, these potential free citizens of a free country, could not appeal to such parents as playmates for their children. But history helped Mark Twain to enjoy the popularity pre-war Germany had refused. When, by the Revolution of 1918, democracy replaced Kaiserism, and consequently the spirit of military instruction ceded to the spirit of a true liberal education, there was no doubt in my mind that Mark Twain would replace, with a few years, the old-fashioned juvenile authors. Already at the end of the year 1918 I decided to do modernized translations of Mark Twain's books, intended mainly for the entertainment of boys and girls. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I knew what was at stake. I knew what prejudices I had to overcome. Publishing business is business, and Mark Twain had never been a best-seller in Germany. Almost 2 years passed before I struck a publishing house which recognized the chance and shared my enthusiasm for reviving Mark Twain's works. It was Ullstein's, publishers of Germany's best-known liberal newspapers, Vossische Zeitung and Berliner Morgenpost, as well as of numerous novels and fictions of all periods, which started the enterprise. During the summer of 1921 Tom Sawyer appeared, but already some months before, when the publication was announced at the Spring Fair of Leipzig, Where the booksellers of all Germany meet an order for Christmas, it became evident that Tom Sawyer's Adventures would outstrip all its competitors in the market for juvenile books. Maybe it was the unusual cover bearing the colored scene of Tom Sawyer painting the fence that attracted more buyers than an old fashioned edition had done, but whatever the reason, the slumbering interest in the American classic awoke. When half a year later The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn followed Tom Sawyer there were about 50,000 German boys and girls waiting for the new Mark Twain. Publishers in this country may not be satisfied with a circulation of 50,000 copies, but in Germany a first edition of that number means unheard of popularity. During the years 1922 and 1923 one edition of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn followed the other, until today Mark Twain is the pet author of all German youth. About 250,000 copies now are circulating, and there is scarcely a boy or a girl to whom the two American lads are not their best playmates. The children's enthusiasm awoke the interest of the adults. The popularity Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn had achieved was reflected in the popularity of other works of Mark Twain. At intervals of about 6 months, Ullstein's published my translations of A Tramp Abroad, Roughing It, and, finally, selections of Mark Twain's sketches, Punch Brother Punch, as well as The Speech on Babies, were literally hits, and copies of these three books also are in the hands of about 250,000 of German readers. The year 1923 was a Mark Twain year in Germany, just as the year 1924 may see a recrudescence of his glory all over this country. The books were printed on the cheapest of paper and bound into cheapest cardboard, a kind of manufacturing this country would scarcely appreciate, but people over there could buy a copy for 50 cents. During the years after the German Revolution books were the only presents which people of the former wealthy middle classes could give each other. St. Nicholas was a bookseller's clerk, and boys and girls learned to enjoy his gifts just as we had once enjoyed the most expensive playthings. When Quakers came to Germany and started their relief work, when American mercy saved millions and millions of German children from starving, many hundreds of thousands of that youth wondered from what sort of paradise beyond the sea those angels came with their load of manna. Once the country of Indian fights, America now changed into the Promised Land. What Quakers have done and continue to do for the bodily health of the new German generation will not be forgotten. On the other hand, that same generation had been starving spiritually, thirsty for a smile, and hungry for another sort of food which only a poet's hand might offer. Again it was an American who helped them out of darkness by richness of his beaming imagination. Mark Twain's relieving laughter made them smile again, just as the sun did with Tom Sawyer and Becky, when after days in the cave Tom glimpsed a far-off speck that looked like daylight. Mark Twain's works produced a gladness all over Germany by the sunshine of his humor. German boys and girls recognized very soon that Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, as well as Becky Thatcher, were the children of a new world, the way they played and talked, the way their parents and their teachers treated them, the independence and self-control on the one hand, and on the other the true democratic equality, were bound to make a mighty impression on the first generation of the new German Republic. For that reason Mark Twain may be considered a Praeceptor Germaniae. Mark Twain reopened the fountain of humor, which had almost dried up in Germany, but his humor is far from being witticism. He followed the lesson of Shakespeare. To be a humorist was not to be a joker, but to be a philosopher, smiling at the world around him and laughing with it. Mark Twain saw most of this earth, and no region of human heart was unknown to him. All pain and all joy, all heights and all depths, he had experienced, but he remembered always the eternal sun shining behind the clouds. Sometimes he split the mist, coldly and mercilessly, but he did it by love. The true humorist sees the world as it is, but his wisdom is one of exaggeration. Mark Twain has often been blamed for his exaggerations. As well blame a microscope for exaggerating and unfolding realities never seen before. The eyes of Mark Twain have been such a microscope, and all the variety of human nature he saw and visualized to an admiring world is truth. Mark Twain's truth belongs to all nations. His Tom Sawyer is as international as Shakespeare's Falstaff or Cervantes' Don Quixote. The old Germany may have shrunk from Mark Twain's magic mirror. The new Germany is laughing before it.
End of Section 28, July 13, 1924. Mark Twain's Broad German Grin. Read by John Greenman. Section 29 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. July 26, 1924. Mark Twain matched German's invention. Son of his host recalls author's buttonless collar and vest replacing suspenders. By T. R. Ibarra. Copyright 1924. By the New York Times Company. By wireless to the New York Times. Berlin, July 25th. Mark Twain would rather have been an inventor than a writer, declares a German who, when he was a child, once saw and heard America's great humorist. The latter visited the home of this German's father during his trip to Germany, and the two got to talking about themselves in a weird hodgepodge of English and German, while the little son of Mark Twain's host, who had read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer until he nearly knew them by heart, listened in breathless silence. "Once I invented a combination lamp and cooking stove," said Mark Twain's host. The humorist promptly replied, "Once I invented a collar that needed no collar button, and also a vest which enabled the wearer to do away with suspenders." From Mark Twain's tone as he spoke, says the German who heard him, one could easily see he was prouder of these inventions than of his books. So jovial was Twain throughout the visit, continues the German, that nobody could have guessed he had just lost the entire fortune amassed from his writings, and had been obliged, at the age of 56, to begin all over again. End of Section 29, July 26, 1924. Mark Twain matched German's invention. Read by John Greenman. Section 30 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. August 10, 1924. Mark Twain's former home still remains a landmark. Famous Fifth Avenue house will be preserved by present owner. Property in same family for 2 centuries. Irving stayed there. By Howard A. Lamb. There is one landmark of little old New York that may still laugh at the assaults of time and apartment house builders. It has been finally decided that the residence at 21 Fifth Avenue, corner of 9th Street, of worldwide interest because it has been the home of both Washington Irving and Mark Twain, is not going to be torn down, not as long as the present owner, Edward Renwick Whittingham, lawyer, of 2 Rector Street, is alive, and he is still a very young man. Sentiment is regarded as a rare thing these days, and getting rarer, especially along Fifth Avenue, but it is nothing else but sentiment and family pride that have made Mr. Whittingham cold to the entreaties of hotel and apartment house operators, and resolved to make the quaint house his home as long as he lives. Other old houses in the neighborhood are vanishing almost overnight to make room for towering apartment buildings. but there are enough left to give the Washington Square neighborhood an atmosphere of its own, and Mr. Whittingham would like to see it perpetuated. Diagonally across the street from Mr. Whittingham's property, for instance, is the house built by Henry Brevoort. On February 24, 1840, the first masked ball ever given in New York was held there. It was marked by the elopement of Matilda Barclay, daughter of the British consul, with a South Carolina youth, regarded as a great scandal in that day. The house is now owned by Mrs. George F. Baker, Jr., herself a descendant of the Brevoorts. Adjacent to 21 Fifth Avenue is the old home of Dr. E. L. Partridge, with a line of the old Randall farm going through it, from which an underground passage used to lead to the Brevoort Hotel, the first hotel on Fifth Avenue. A block away is the former home of Charles A. Dana of the Sun. Mr. Whittingham's property, a part of the old Brevoort farm, has been longer in the hands of one family than any other in New York, 250 years. The young lawyer feels that it would be almost a sacrilege to let it go. He is unmarried, however, and is not occupying it at the present time. The Brevoort farm belonged originally to Bastian Ellis, who received it December 18, 1667, from Richard Nichols, first English governor of New York. It passed from Ellis to his son-in-law John Hendrick Brevoort in 1701, and has been in the Brevoort family ever since. The original owner of the present house was James Renwick, great-grandfather of Mr. Whittingham, for 30 years ahead of the Natural Science Department of King's College. He died in 1862. To the Renwick family belongs the honor of establishing the first line of regular sailing vessels between this country and England. William Renwick was interested, with Alexander Hamilton and others, in founding the Bank of New York in 1784. Spare room for Irving. Mrs. James Renwick was Margaret Ann Brevoort, daughter of Hendrick Brevoort, the stubborn old Knickerbocker who "put the bend" in Broadway because he would not let it go through his cherry orchard. He also prevented the opening of 11th Street through his property because it would run too close to his house, which stood on the present site of Grace Church. Professor Renwick was a close friend of Washington Irving. He traveled with Irving in England when Irving was writing Bracebridge Hall, and also accompanied him on trips over the continent. It was because of this comradeship that Professor Renwick set aside the middle room on the second floor as a spare bedroom for the author of Rip Van Winkle to use whenever he came to town from his home at Sunnyside up the Hudson. James A. Renwick, Professor Renwick's grandson, and his cousin, Mrs. Bessie Whittingham, held the property between them until last August, when Mrs. Whittingham's son, Edward, obtained sole possession. The apartment in the basement is now occupied by Dr. Robert H. Kahn, who moved into the building when Mark Twain and his family left, and for many years used the entire premises. He had known the Clemens family for years. At his country home he still keeps the orchestrelle with which Twain entertained himself in the Fifth Avenue house, playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and other compositions of which he was fond. The house itself, now almost a century old, was designed by the original owner's son, James Renwick, Jr., the architect who drew the plans for several churches in the same neighborhood, the Church of the Ascension, the First Presbyterian Church, and Grace Church, as well as some of the buildings at Vassar College and the Smithsonian Institution. There is an ecclesiastical suggestion about the windows of the house, which are gracefully rounded at the top, and the rooms are of stately proportions. It was built shortly after the opening of Fifth Avenue, and was the first one on the block. Mark Twain moved in during the fall of 1904, and remained until the summer of 1908, when he occupied Stormfield, just built for him at Redding, Connecticut. There he died April 21, 1910, aged 74. Dictated in bed. Albert Bigelow Paine, Twain's biographer, lived in the house for a while to help carry on his work. Mark continued to indulge a weakness for doing his literary work in bed, dictating his biographical notes to Paine's stenographer as he lay voluptuously under the blankets, garbed in a
handsome silk dressing gown of rich Persian pattern propped against the snowy pillows. Clemens was passionately fond of billiards, and when Mrs. H. H. Rogers presented him with a handsome billiard table he converted one of the bedrooms into a billiard room. With Paine he played the game at every opportunity. George Harvey and Peter Findlay Dunn were occasional opponents, and Mr. and Mrs. Martin W. Littleton, who lived near by, came over for an occasional three-handed game in the evening. Littleton was then engaged in the defense of Harry Thaw, on trial for the murder of Stanford White, and used to entertain Clemens with interesting sidelights of the day's developments in court. Occasionally Clemens was the center of interest at small dinners given at the Brevoort Hotel, a step from his own door, and his home became the meeting place of some of the shining literary lights of the day. To his dinners came, in addition to George Harvey and Peter Findlay Dunn, William Dean Howells, Augustus Thomas, whose play The Witching Hour was then at the height of its success, and Brander Matthews. Mark Twain was a conspicuous figure in the Washington Square neighborhood. He was a man whose personality naturally dominated the crowd about him. The white suit he always wore, and his bushy crown of silver hair, would have attracted attention even if he were not famous for other things. At times he went out for a stroll with General Dan Sickles, then in his 80s and handicapped by a wooden leg, who lived in a mansion across the street. He bought his cigars from Joe Isaacs, who died in New York this summer. Isaacs kept his store in a corner of Alexander McClellan's roadhouse at the southeast corner of 6th Avenue and 11th Street, torn down in 1912. Here the braw Scot served fine old musty ale and mutton pies that won him a steady reputation for 42 years. Liked cheap cigars. McClellan's was the resort of gentlemen, where men like Chester A. Arthur and William Travers Jerome, out for a cutter ride on a frosty night, might drop in for a nip of spiced rum. Even Theodore Roosevelt, then police commissioner and at grips with the saloon power, was obliged to tell "Old Aleck," who is still hale and hearty, by the way, that he conducted a model drinking place. Clemens's taste ran to strong black cigars rather than to liquid refreshments, so that he seldom stopped at Alex's hospitable place. The cheaper the cigars the better he liked them, but he probably bought so many that Isaacs considered him a welcome customer. It must have been Clemens himself who remarked that he "smoked constantly, loathed exercise, and had no other regularity of habits." He often received presents of the most expensive imported cigars, but he never smoked them. He handed them out to his friends and callers. Once he passed an English briar root pipe to Paine and said, "I'd like to have you smoke that a year or two, and when it gets so you can't stand it, maybe it will suit me." On pleasant days Mark Twain liked to stroll up Fifth Avenue, sometimes as far as the Carnegie home, on 92nd Street, and come back on the electric stage, from which he could enjoy the panorama while he smoked without interference. At times he turned at 59th Street, rested at the Plaza Hotel, or sat on a bench in Central Park. On Sunday mornings he would time his return to see the crowds leaving the churches. He liked the throng. The homage of the multitude was dear to him, not because he loved adulation for its own sake, but because his heart was big enough to fully appreciate the tribute of a people's affection. Children loved him. It was the most precious reward of his life, the final harvest, says Paine, and he had the courage to claim it. Children were as fond of Clemens as he was of them. Frequently on his walks he got no further than Madison Square Park, then the center of a fine residence section, because the youngsters, sometimes accompanied by their nurses, would beg him to sit down on a bench and tell them stories. This he would do for an hour or two, reading from Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, or making up tales as he went along. One of the little girls who loved to listen was Margaret McClellan, who is now grown up. "As I remember Mr. Clemens," she said the other day, "he was
a strange man, always alone, always thoughtful. We children adored him. The stories he told me became the subject of my dreams. One of them was about a bad little girl named Polly, and he would end it by saying, 'Are you ever a naughty Polly?'" But in spite of brilliant dinners, hosts of friends, material prosperity, and the love of people all over the world, the 4 years Mark Twain lived at 21 Fifth Avenue were some of the loneliest and most miserable of his life. The loss of his wife was an uncontrollable sorrow. Bernard Shaw had linked him with Edgar Allan Poe as one of the two outstanding literary geniuses of America, and had compared his works from a historical standpoint with those of Voltaire, but Clemens felt that he had accomplished little except to amuse people. He was submerged in a pessimistic philosophy, and died a disappointed man. End of Section 30, August 10, 1924. Mark Twain's former home still remains a landmark. Read by John Greenman. Section 31 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. October 15, 1924. A Unique Autobiography. In the 2 volumes of Mark Twain's autobiography, which the Harpers are bringing out, we have a work out of the ordinary in many senses. The scheme of the writing is such as it never entered the head of another man to conceive. It is without order, chronological or other, shows very little feeling for division or proportion of subjects, is absolutely hit or miss in method and effect, yet it makes, for the most part, entertaining reading. Mark Twain, apparently of his own volition, wrote various scraps of reminiscence. He did this at long intervals of time, and seemed to fall out of the whim of going on with the task of an autobiography at all. But some of his friends and literary advisers pitched upon the idea of pinning him down during his customary mornings in bed or while walking about his room, and inducing him to dictate whatever came into his mind out of an interesting past. The whole product is thus uncoordinated and sprawling, but goes extremely well with the haphazard and discursive mood which so often became predominant in Mark Twain during his later years. An amusing aspect of this lack of plan in his autobiography is that Mark Twain came to delight in it and to praise it as a wonderful literary invention. At first he was averse to attempting anything of the sort, and thought that nothing could be done with it, but little by little his distaste was overcome, and toward the end we find him triumphantly arguing with Mr. Howells that this way of writing an autobiography was the best that had ever been devised, and would insure a multitude of readers for years to come. He felt sure that what enthralled and absorbed him at any given moment would be certain to come to others with a spontaneity and verve that could not be commanded in an ordered narrative. The result was a mass of unrelated and disjointed recollections, the author often breaking off at a word, or giving first place to some new idea which crowded out the old one that he was perfectly ready to drop. Yet somehow the volumes succeed in recalling vividly Mark Twain in habit as he was. This autobiography of his abounds in the rough humor of exaggeration of which he was so fond, yet it occasionally embalms, as in the characterization of his mother and of his wife, some of that delicate sentiment and nice perception exquisitely expressed with which his writings have made all familiar. There is also a record of many personal contacts and experiences which go to making the full picture of his life. Occasionally, too, the book gives fresh revelations of Mark Twain's independence of character and of judgment, together with his capacity for moral indignation. His autobiography may be formless, but it is very much alive. The one thing which he cannot reproduce is the impenetrable mask which he was able to make his face assume, with the hesitant drawl signalizing his approach to witticisms,
and to the Orson-like utterances with which he delighted to flutter the dovecotes in private conversation and at public meetings. End of Section 31, October 15, 1924. A Unique Autobiography, read by John Greenman. Section 32 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman, with help from Eberhard Schneider. October 19, 1924. Mirror of the Heart and Mind of a Great American. 2 volumes of an intimate autobiography published 14 years after Mark Twain's death. A review by H. I. Brock. Mark Twain's Autobiography, with an introduction by Albert Bigelow Paine, 2 volumes, New York, Harper & Brothers. It should be observed, in the first place, that the thing to do with Mark Twain's autobiography is to read it, not to write about it. All the commentary really needed has been furnished by Samuel M. Clemens, himself speaking, as he says, from the grave, distilling an enriched and ennobled essence of himself in which his virtues and his faults are equally preserved and mellowed. "I intend," he writes, "that this autobiography shall become a model for all future autobiographies when it is published after my death, and I also intend that it shall be read and admired a good many centuries because of its form and method, a form and method whereby the past and the present are constantly brought face to face, resulting in contrasts which newly fire up the interest all along like contact of flint and steel. Moreover, this autobiography of mine does not select from my life its showy episodes, but deals merely in the common experiences which go to make up the life of the average human being." So indeed it does, even while it presents the autobiographer with an extraordinary human being both in himself and in the presentation of those common experiences. "It is a deliberate system," he adds, "and the law of the system is that I shall talk about the matter which for the moment interests me, and cast it aside and talk about something else the moment its interest for me is exhausted." The application of the system, more or less unconscious at first, one suspects, covers with considerable gaps and intervals 40 active years, the years from 1870 to the death of the autobiographer in 1910. The first jotting relates to this father's aspirations as a landed proprietor of 75,000 acres of Tennessee lands, bought for $400 down. 10 years are allowed to elapse, and then come memorabilia of General Grant, with who, as the publisher of the General's memoirs, Mark Twain had close personal relations in 1885. In 1897, and for 2 years thereafter, writing far overseas in Vienna, he is chiefly concerned with vivid recollections of his boyhood in Missouri. In 1904 he is residing in the vicinity of Florence for Mrs. Clemens's health's sake. He writes, therefore, autobiographically, about Florentine villas. In 1906 he undertakes, with the aid of a stenographer furnished by his biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, the systematic application by dictation of his unsystematic system. His text, or starting point for any particular day's dictation, is often taken from that morning's newspaper. But, true to his autobiographical creed, he doesn't always stick to the text. To quote from his editor, "It was his custom to stay in bed until noon, and he remained there during most of the earlier dictations, clad in a handsome dressing gown, propped against great snowy pillows. He loved this loose luxury and ease, and found it conducive to thought. On a little table beside him, where lay his cigars, papers, pipes, and various knickknacks, shone a reading lamp, making more brilliant his rich coloring and the gleam of his shining hair. There you have the stage setting, but it was only so in his Fifth Avenue house. In the country, in New Hampshire, and afterward at his own place, Stormfield, in Connecticut, the autobiography was dictated while he paced the veranda, clad in creamy white flannels and loose morocco slippers. Whatever the setting, the autobiographical system was essentially the same. One result of the system in practice is that the interest of the reader is rarely, if ever, exhausted. Another is an extraordinarily complete and rounded picture of the writer, in spite of the proposed jumble of his recollections, following a course which begins nowhere, follows no specific route, and can never reach an end while I am alive. This model, which is to serve as a beacon to all future autobiographers, certainly owes something to earlier models, particularly to that masterpiece of imaginary autobiography, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. It is yet a vehicle admirably adapted to be the mirror of Mark Twain, and of the generation of which Mark Twain was sublimate cynic sentimentalist, blaspheming and loving with all his might, living with every keen sense of him, and talking prodigiously. The keynote of Twain's extraordinary character and essential Americanism may be discovered in his vaunting price of ancestry and transparent pretense of making light of that pride. Back of the Virginian Clemenses is a dim procession of ancestors stretching back to Noah's time. According to tradition, some of them were pirates, writes Mark, and confesses that in his time he has desired himself to be a pirate. But chiefest matter of pride is Geoffrey Clement, who helped to sentence Charles I to death. As a regicide he was greater than a king, and thereby has Mark been made vain. But for most of this ancestral pride, which may no more than Pooh-Bah's be denied, he takes refuge behind the lovely frail figure of his mother, and her slender small body, and her heart so large that everybody's grief and everybody's joys found welcome in it and hospitable accommodation. She it was who, to the day of her death, felt a strong interest in the whole world and everything and everybody in it, and in all her life never knew such a thing as half-hearted interest in affairs and people, or an interest which drew a line and left certain affairs and was indifferent to certain people. This friend of Satan, it is written from the grave, for is the arch-fiend not a sinner like the rest, she said? Yet nobody prays for him. This friend of Satan was a most gentle spirit, and an unstudied and unconscious pathos was her native speech. But one day in our village I saw a vicious devil of a Corsican, a common terror in the town, chasing his grown daughter past cautious male citizens with a heavy rope in his hands and declaring he would wear it out on her. My mother spread her door wide to the refugee, and then, instead of closing and locking it after her, stood in it and stretched her arms across it, barring the way. The man swore, cursed, threatened her with the rope, but she did not flinch or show any sign of fear. She only stood straight and fine, and lashed him, shamed him, derided him, defied him in tones not audible to the middle of the street, but audible to the man's conscience and dormant manhood, and he asked her pardon and gave her his rope, and said with a most great and blasphemous oath that she was the bravest woman he ever saw, and so went his way without another word, and troubled her no more. Yet privately this gentle, bravest woman was no better than an aristocrat. She who had been named Jane Lambton came from Kentucky and was married in the Kentucky city of Lexington; was proud that the Lambtons, now Earls of Durham, had occupied the family lands for 900 years, that they were feudal lords of Lambton Castle, and holding the highest position of ancestors of hers when the Norman conqueror came over to divert the Englishry. Son Mark pretended to jeer at this maternal pride in holding land 900 years. He said it was done with the friendly assistance of an entail, that she was merely descended from an entail, and might as well be proud of being descended from a mortgage. But nevertheless is son Mark perpetually recalling these Lambtons, and rolling under his tongue their estate of belted earls. And he will never have done with the story of the 100,000 acres of Tennessee lands which his father held to found the family fortune. This Tennessee land intrudes into the "purposed jumble" of the model autobiography, like King Charles' head in Mr. Dick's calligraphic memorials, which, incidentally, brings in again that pride-begetting regicide. Here is palpable pretext of the inner and spiritual grace of democracy. Nevertheless, the subject conducts to an excellent admission. In the small town of Hannibal, Missouri, when I was a boy, everybody was poor, but didn't know it, and everybody was comfortable, and did know it. And there were grades of society, people of good family, people of unclassified family, people of no family. Everybody knew everybody, and was affable to everybody, and nobody put on any visible airs. Yet class lines were quite clearly drawn, and the familiar social life of each class was restricted to that class. It was a little democracy which was full of liberty, equality, and the 4th of July, and sincerely so, too. Yet you perceived that the aristocratic taint was there. Mark connects the taint with the peculiar institution of slavery and the fact that the town's population had come from the slave States. But after all, the proud Lambtons of Lambton Castle did not come from slave States, nor did Geoffrey Clement, the regicide, proceed out of Barbary. Incidentally, hereabouts is introduced the original of Colonel Mulberry Sellers, who was in fact a Lambton of Kentucky, and very proud of the Lambtons of Durham. James he was named, a cousin of the elder Mrs. Clemens, and floated all his days in a tinted mist of magnificent dreams. And here also, and cropping up anywhere in the narration, are vivid boyhood recollections, as of the night when Mark was 14 and was to play bear at a costume party of his younger elders. He practised everything a bear could do, and many things no bear could ever do with dignity, without his bear's disguise, and with no disguise whatever, in fact, all innocent, that two young ladies behind a screen were eagerly observing. A smothered burst of feminine snickers betrayed the audience, and during several weeks thereafter Mark could not look any young lady in the face, not any at all, because the two behind the screen remained unidentified. It was only in Calcutta, 47 years later, that one of the culprits, "old and gray haired but very handsome," gleefully confessed. Then there was Uncle John's farm, 4 miles from the village of Florida, where Mark was born in 1835. It was a heavenly place for a boy. The house was a double log one, with a spacious roof (roofed in) connecting it with the kitchen. In the summer the table was set in the middle of that shady and breezy floor, and the sumptuous meals, well, it makes me cry to think of them: fried chicken, roast pig, wild and tame turkeys, ducks and geese, venison just killed, squirrels, rabbits, pheasants, partridges, prairie chickens, wheat bread, hot rolls, hot corn pone, fresh corn boiled on the ear, succotash, butter beans, string beans, tomatoes, peas, Irish potatoes, sweet potatoes, buttermilk, sweet milk, clabber, watermelons, muskmelons, cantaloupes, all fresh from the garden, apple pie, peach pie, pumpkin pie, apple dumplings, peach cobbler. I can't remember the rest. What has been remembered is enough to indicate that folks on Uncle John's farm were at least comfortably fed and amply provided with those delectable varieties of hot bread of which Europe has remained so persistently ignorant, and which the North, because of not knowing how to make it properly, pretends to regard as bad for the insides. I can see the farm yet with perfect clearness. I can see all its belongings, all its details: the family room of the house, with a trundle bed in one corner and a spinning wheel in another, a wheel whose rising and falling wail, heard from a distance, was the mournfulest of all sounds to me, and made me homesick and low-spirited, and filled my atmosphere with the wandering spirits of the dead. The vast fireplace, piled high on winter's nights with flaming hickory logs, from whose ends a sugary sap bubbled out, but did not go to waste, for we scraped it off and ate it. The lazy cat spread out on the rough hearthstones, the drowsy dogs braced against the jambs and blinking, my aunt in one chimney corner, knitting, my uncle in the other, smoking his corncob pipe, the slick and carpetless oak floor faintly mirroring the dancing flame tongues and freckled with black indentations where fire coals had popped out and died a leisurely death. Half a dozen children romping in the background twilight, split-bottom chairs here and there, some with rockers, a cradle out of service, but waiting with confidence. In the early cold mornings a snuggle of children in shirts and chemises, occupying the hearthstones and procrastinating. They could not bear to leave that comfortable place and go out on the wind-swept floor space between the house and kitchen, where the general tin basin stood, and wash. Along outside of the front fence ran the country road, dusty in the summer time, and a good place for snakes. They liked to lie in it and sun themselves. When they were rattlesnakes or puff adders we killed them. When they were black snakes or races, or belonged to the fabled hoop breed, we fled without shame. When they were house snakes or garters we carried them home and put them in Aunt Patsy's work basket for a surprise, for she was prejudiced against snakes, and always when she took the basket in her lap and they began to climb out of it, it disordered her mind. She never could seem to get used to them. Her opportunities went for nothing. And she was always cold toward bats, too, and could not bear them, and yet I think a bat is as friendly a bird as there is. My mother was Aunt Patsy's sister and had the same wild superstitions. A bat is beautifully soft and silky. I do not know any creature that is pleasanter to the touch or is more grateful for caressings, if offered in the right spirit. I know all about these coleoptera, because our great cave, 3 miles below Hannibal, was multitudinously stocked with them, and often I brought them home to amuse my mother with. It was easy to manage if it was a school day, because then I had ostensibly been to school and hadn't any bats. She was not a suspicious person, but full of trust and confidence, and when I said, "There's something in my coat pocket for you," she would put her hand in, but she always took it out again herself. I didn't have to tell her. It was remarkable the way she couldn't learn to like private bats. The more experience she had, the more she could not change her views. There were swings made of bark stripped from hickory saplings. They usually broke when a child was 40 feet in the air, and this was why so many bones had to be mended each year. I had no ill luck myself, but none of my cousins escaped. There were 8 of them, and at one time or another they broke 14 arms among them, but it cost next to nothing, for the doctor worked by the year, $25 for the whole family. Not to count that every old woman was a doctor and gathered her own medicines in the woods, and know how to compound doses that would stir the vitals of a cast-iron dog. The country schoolhouse stood in a clearing in the woods and was more or less regularly attended. Mark's first visit was at the age of 7. A strapping girl of 15, in the customary sunbonnet and calico dress, asked me if I used tobacco, meaning did I chew it. I said no. It roused her scorn. Mark confesses that he never could learn to chew tobacco, though in the matter of smokes his capacity for evil varieties of the weed was notorious. Wheeling long nines were his favorite because he had acquired an affection for them when he was a cub pilot on the Mississippi. He said, "When a cigar costs 4 1/4 or 5 cents, I smoke it with confidence." Not without profit one might stray from this point to Clemens's description of a villa he knew near Florence, a house built 400 years ago for Cosmo I, and containing uncounted rooms, not omitting a salon 40 feet in each of 3 directions, called the Great Sahara. But it is just as well to skip to John Hay, who, even before he was Secretary of State, was not afraid of Horace Greeley, yet was not altogether brave. For Hay and Twain being discovered together on a Sunday morning chatting as freely and gaily as if it had been a week day, by Mrs. Hay, it was easily perceived that the bottom had fallen out of his valor no less than his vocabulary, At the door he did not invite Twain to call again, but said pathetically and apologetically, "She is very strict about Sunday," thus proving that no courage is absolutely perfect. With his manner of speaking his mind and writing it, and with his record as editor of the Virginia City Enterprise, out in Nevada, at a time when the habit of the duello was strong with Western editors, it is surprising that Mark confesses to but one duel, and that only arranged, not consummated. There was a challenge, some pistol practice, and not every effective fire by Editor Clemens. But a second's neat job in shooting off the head of a sparrow so terrified the rival faction that they declined to fight on any terms. Nevertheless, Clemens had to flee the State as a duelist. "When I laid down my editorial pen," he records, "I had 4 horsewhippings and 2 duels coming to me." As an editor retired, and an autobiographer, which is a kind of historian, in active practice, Mark Twain makes the discovery of the wide difference in interest between news and history. That news is history in its first and best form, its vivid and fascinating form, and that history is the pale and tranquil reflection of it. He observes that in his autobiography, as at that stage it was being written by daily dictation, he is mixing these two forms together all the time. He is hoping by this method of procedure to secure the values of both, because the autobiographical dictation, dealing always with the thing that immediately interests him, that thing is infallibly either something he has got by reading the infernal newspapers or by talking to somebody. So he gets a fresh start from news every day, wherever his history lands him. In his own case, at least, the plan works. For instance, General Daniel E. Sickles arrives, at 81 years, January 16, 1906. Sickles lost a leg at Gettysburg, which suggests the reflection that soldiers who have lost a leg in battle value the lost leg above the one that is left. And Twain recalls walking across from his Fifth Avenue house, down towards the square, to Sickles' house, where the drawing room, floors, walls, and ceilings are cluttered up and overlaid with lion skins, tiger skins, leopard skins, elephant skins, more animals, more skins, here and there and everywhere more and more skins. It was as if a menagerie had undressed in the place. At an earlier date, on a bench in Washington Square, Twain saw the most of Louis Stevenson. R.L.S. was most scantily furnished with flesh. His clothes seemed to fall into hollows as if there were nothing inside but the frame of a sculptor's statue. Between them they coined a new name, submerged renown, for the sort of author whose fame lives down in a deep water, for what the reviewer says never finds its way down into those placid deeps, nor the newspaper sneers, nor any breath of the winds of slander blowing above. Down there they never hear of these things. Their idol may be painted clay up there at the surface, and fade and crumble and blow away, there being much weather there, but down below he is gold and adamant and indestructible. The conversation arose because a bookseller had just told Stevenson that a man named Davis, never heard of by the author of Treasure Island, was the most read author in America. Down in the sunless region of eternal drudgery and starvation wages he found his readers by the millions. Henry H. Rogers, Standard Oil and Steel magnate, had been figuring as a witness in Boston. That reminded Mark of how this closest and most valued friend had saved his copyrights from being swallowed up in the wreck and ruin, early in the '90s, of Mark's publishing firm, Charles L. Webster and Company. It was a failure on a grand scale, and it is familiar history that Mark went to work and paid his creditors cent for cent. But it took time. Rogers contrived the delay. Of 96 creditors, only 3 or 4 insisted on their immediate pound of flesh. "I have never," writes Mark, "resented their animosity except in my autobiography, and even there not in spite, not in malice, but frankly, and in only a brief chapter, a chapter which can never wound them, for I have confidence that they will be in hell before it is printed." Here Mark records his opinion that whatever lofty and charming and lovable thing it is to be a gentleman, Henry H. Rogers could have sat for the portrait. It was as his publisher chiefly that Twain knew Ulysses S. Grant. There is much about General Grant in the Autobiography, especially during the time when the General was dying slowly and bravely of cancer. One day Twain brought a young sculptor, Gerhardt, to the General's house to correct from life a bust he had made from a photograph. Gerhardt was admitted to the sick room. The General was stretched out in a reclining chair, with his feet supported upon an ordinary chair. He was muffled up in dressing gowns and afghans, with his black woolen skull cap on his head. The ladies one was the General's wife took the skull cap off and began to discuss his nose and his forehead, and they made him turn this way and that way and the other way to get different views and profiles of his features. He took it all patiently and made no complaint. Twain is a hero worshiper of Grant in spite of having been his publisher. A clergyman, disguised as Mr. N., reported that Grant in his last hours pressed his hand, Mr. N.'s, and delivered himself of this astounding remark: "Thrice have I been in the shadow of the valley of death, and thrice have I come out again." Says Mark succinctly, "General Grant never used flowers of speech, and, dead or alive, he never could have uttered anything like that, either as a quotation or otherwise." But when Mark asked the General who originated the idea of the famous March to the Sea, whether it was himself or Sherman, Grant said, "Neither. The enemy did it." That time Mark had called upon the General, who was not yet very ill, with his little daughter, Susy, whose death in her early 20s supplies a moving chapter in the book, and whose childish diary furnishes the text for many another chapter, becomes the news peg upon which is lovingly hung the father's excursion into history. Susy's spelling is frequently desperate, but Mark, who was the prize speller of that school of his back in Hannibal, Missouri, lets Susy's spelling stand. "I cannot bring myself to change any line or word of Susy's sketch of me," Clemens writes, for the child's diary set out to be, and pretty fairly was, a biography of her father. At this point it is noted that in homes frequented by literary people, lawyers, judges, professors, the talk of the children is curious and funny musketry clatter of little words, interrupted at intervals by the heavy artillery crash of a word of such imposing sound and size that it seems to shake the ground and rattle the windows." And the father adds proudly, "As a child Susy had good fortune with her large words, and employed many of them." The Clemens children, but not Susy, seem to have sworn vigorously upon occasion also, but not in the language of their father, whose supply of brimstone for utterance was not surprising in an ex pilot of the Mississippi. They borrowed their misplaced pieties from a little German maid who had to do the young thing's hair, and when she was done exploded her thanks toward the sky in this form:
Gott sei Dank. Ich bin schon fertig mit dem gottverdammten Haar.
Mark says he is not quite brave enough to translate this, but he does not shrink from setting down in cold type this:
"I believe that the trade of critic in literature, music, and the drama is the most degraded of all trades, and that it has no real value, certainly no large value."
Mark is thus by his words as by his deeds abundantly proclaimed a man of courage. When Blaine was nominated against Cleveland he dared, though a resident of Hartford at the time, to announce his intention of voting for Cleveland.
"On election day we went to the polls and consummated our hellish design."
One of the "we" was his friend the Reverend Joe Twichell, who by that act
most seriously damaged himself with his congregation.
Though he had been their pastor ever since the Civil War, they were near dismissing Twichell from his pulpit for his political heresy. They didn't do it, but it was a close call. Since then, says Mark, he became persistent in voting right. Mark is then struck by the fact that
"In this country there are perhaps 80,000 preachers. Not more than 20 of them are politically independent. The rest cannot be politically independent. They must vote the ticket of their congregation. They do it and are justified."
The subject might be pursued, followed into the green pastures with the sheep like folk that we are, but, as was broadly hinted in the beginning, the only satisfactory way to deal with Mark Twain's autobiography is to read it. When that is done, what he has written about his wife, Lavinia Langdon, is worthy to set beside what he has written about his mother. Mrs. Clemens is eloquently acknowledged a perfect character and helpmeet, but Mark's heedlessness, his easy way with the social proprieties, distressed her. He might any time wear his arctics right into the East Room at the White House. After a polite dinner party he had always to be dusted off for social errors. Mrs. Clemens and the children undertook to edit his manners as they did his manuscript. It seems he endured the ordeal in each case cheerfully. But this is a serious autobiography, even if it has not been too seriously selected from in this place. Elder people who read it will be reminded of much that they have forgotten. Younger people will learn a lot about their elders, including some quite famous and important persons, and many that are neither. End of Section 32, October 19, 1924. Mirror of the Heart and Mind of a Great American. Read by John Greenman, with help from Eberhard Schneider. Section 33 of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. December 28, 1924. Mark Twain's burglar, now a devoted reader of Man He Robbed. Notice:
To the next burglar. There is only plated ware in this house now and henceforth. You will find it in that brass thing in the dining room over in the corner of the basket of kittens. If you want the basket, put the kittens in the brass thing. Do not make a noise, it disturbs the family. You will find rubbers in the front hall by that thing that has the umbrellas in it, chiffonnier, I think they call it, or pergola, or something like that. Please close the door when you go away. Very truly yours, S. L. Clemens. Yes, said a giant of a man with a heavy face and large, powerful hands. Yes, that little note was called forth by me. It was written just after a friend of mine and myself broke into Mark Twain's place, Stormfield.
He smiled at Mark Twain's now famous bit of fooling with a reminiscent air.
It was a long time ago, he went on, staring at nothing. 16 years.
He lapsed into silence. Do you remember much about it?
Yes, he replied, calmly. I remember it all right. I got 10 years in the Connecticut State Prison for it.
After a pause he added with a chuckle,
It was that brass thing mentioned by Mark Twain in his little note to the next nocturnal visitor that made all the trouble. That brass thing was a large brass bowl on the sideboard, and when we tried to get the silver out my friend noticed it. He was afraid we'd knock it off, so he took it down carefully and laid it on the floor. Well, that was a bad move. You see, said the ex-burglar in a matter-of-fact tone, we didn't want to make any more noise than we could help, anyway. And when we tried to break into the sideboard it began to seem pretty risky, so we decided to take the sideboard out. We moved it down the road a way and
You what?
Moved it out of the house and down the road, he replied patiently.
The whole sideboard?
Sure. And when we got it out and away from the house we opened it. Well, that was all right, but we went back after that to see what else we could find.
The faux pas.
We didn't get very far on that second trip. My friend was moving around in a quiet sort of way, when all of a sudden there came a terrific bang from the part of the room where he was. It was that brass thing he had taken so carefully off the sideboard. He'd gone and stumbled over it in the dark, where it lay on the floor. Well, after that things began to happen, and they happened fast. Somebody came down from upstairs and turned on a flashlight from the stair landing. "Hello," said this person, but we didn't wait to answer politely. We decided that it was about time to blow, and we did that without losing any time. We decided to get the early morning train away from those parts. That was a bad move, too. There weren't very many people on it, and we were a little conspicuous, I guess. You know how all those trains are. Everybody knows everybody else, or pretty close to it, but we were strangers. However, we didn't have much time to feel out of it on account of being strangers. All of a sudden 12 men came into the car, and the way they looked at us made us pretty sure they wanted to have us join them. My friend ran to the other end of the car, out through the door, and jumped off the train. It's a wonder he didn't break his neck. That train must have been going about 50 miles an hour. I didn't have much time to think about what had happened to him, though. Those fellows made a beeline for me. The first of them had a gun, and it was pointed in my direction, so I took out my own gun. I had it right here, like this, in my right-hand coat pocket. I took it out and let fly with 2 or 3 shots toward the ceiling of the car. I thought I might be able to scare them, but I was fooled. They were all old hands at that sort of thing. One of them got close enough to hit me over the head with a blackjack. Right here is where he landed.
The ex-burglar pushed back the hair from his forehead and showed a white scar just at the hair's edge. His favorite author.
He hit me with it. went on the ex-burglar, frowning. "And then I got mad. I grabbed hold of him and we started to wrestle around in the aisle of the car. I tripped him, but he swung me around as we fell and landed on top of me. He was a big man, bigger than me. He had me by the wrist, but I was crazy by that time, couldn't see what I was doing, on account of the blood in my eyes. I wriggled the gun around into something and pulled. Later I learned I'd shot the policeman in the leg. I say later, because that's all I can remember until I found myself lying out on the embankment beside the train with handcuffs on. Then came the trial, and I got 10 years. It was interesting to hear what Mark Twain had to say about my visit. He said I scared away most of the servants and didn't get what I was after, and that now I was in jail, and that if I kept on I would go to Congress."
Albert Bigelow Paine, in his biography of Mark Twain, says: "Claude, the butler, fired a pistol after them (the burglars) to hasten their departure, and Clemens, wakened by the shots, thought the family was opening champagne, and went to sleep again." One would expect that the Mark Twain burglar might have some feeling of bitterness in connection with any Mark Twain products, but this is far from being the case. The ex-burglar is, as a matter of fact, a Mark Twain enthusiast. He has read most of the author's writings, and they remain his favorite books. Indeed, the ex-burglar was discovered through his coming to the establishment of Harper & Brothers to get the recently published autobiography of Mark Twain. While he was getting it he modestly divulged the information that he had once paid the famous author an evening visit without invitation.
"My visit to Mark Twain was the last such exploit I ever made," he said. "Not because I was a disappointed burglar, as Mark Twain said, for I took away all the silverware, but because I have since come to the conclusion that crime doesn't pay."
The ex-burglar has had further relations with the Clemens family since the unhappy episode which landed him in Connecticut State Prison for 10 years, but these relations have been of a far pleasanter sort.
"Since my release from prison some 9 years ago," he said, "I had the privilege and pleasure of meeting the only living member of Mark Twain's family, Mrs. Clara Clemens Gabrielowitsch. It is to the generosity and practical assistance of Mark Twain's talented daughter that I owe my real chance to make good and to become a useful and law-abiding citizen and member of the society I hated and fought so long."
A deceptive burglar alarm. Mark Twain had other encounters with burglars. Of one of these he writes the following episode in the autobiography:
"That burglar alarm which Susy mentions led a gay and careless life and had no principles. It was generally out of order at one point or another, and there was plenty of opportunity, because all the windows and doors in the house, from the cellar up to the top floor, were connected with it. In its seasons of being out of order it could trouble us for only a very little while. We quickly found out that it was fooling us, and that it was buzzing its blood-curdling alarm merely for its own amusement. Then we would shut it off and send to New York for the electrician, there not being one in all Hartford in those days. Then, when the repairs were finished, we would set the alarm again and re-establish our confidence in it. It never did any real business, except upon one single occasion. All the rest of its expensive career was frivolous and without purpose. Just that one time it performed its duty, and its whole duty, gravely, seriously, admirably. It let fly about 2 o'clock one black and dreary March morning, and I turned out promptly, because I knew that it was not fooling this time. The bathroom door was on my side of the bed. I stepped in there, turned up the gas, looked at the annunciator, turned off the alarm, so far as the door indicated was concerned, thus stopping the racket. Then I came back to bed. Mrs. Clemens said, "What was it?" I said, "It was the cellar door." She said, "Was it a burglar, do you think?" "Yes," I said, "of course it was. Do you suppose it was a Sunday school superintendent?" She said, "What do you suppose he wants?"
Probably after vegetables.
I said, "I suppose he wants jewelry, but he is not acquainted with the house and he thinks it is in the cellar. I don't like to disappoint a burglar whom I am not acquainted with and who has done me no harm, but if he had had common sagacity enough to inquire I could have told him we kept nothing down there but coal and vegetables. Still, it may be that he is acquainted with this place and that what he really wants is coal and vegetables. On the whole, I think it is vegetables he is after." She said,
"Are you going down to see?"
"No," I said, "I could not be of any assistance. Let him select for himself."
Then she said, "But suppose he comes up to the ground floor?"
I said, "Well, that's all right. We shall know it the minute he opens a door on that floor. It will set off the alarm." Just then the terrific buzzing broke out again. I said, "He has arrived. I told you he would. I know all about burglars and their ways. They are systematic people." I went into the bathroom to see if I was right, and I was. I shut off the dining room and stopped the buzzing and came back to bed. My wife said,
"What do you suppose he is after now?" Value of the device.
I said, "I think he has got all the vegetables he wants, and is coming up for the napkin rings and odds and ends for the wife and the children. They all have families, burglars have, and they are always thoughtful of them, always take a few necessities of life for themselves and the rest as tokens of remembrance for the family. In taking them they do not forget us. Those very things represent tokens of his remembrance of us also. We never get them again. The memory of the attention remains embalmed in our hearts." She said, "Are you going down to see what it is he wants now?" "No," I said, "I am no more interested than I was before. These are experienced people. They know what they want. I should be of no help to him. I think he is after ceramics and bric a brac and such things. If he knows the house he knows that that is all that he can find on the dining room floor."
She said, "Suppose he comes up here?"
I said, "That is all right. He will give us notice." She said, "What shall we do then?" I said, "Climb out of the window." She said,
"Well, what is the use of a burglar alarm for us?"
I said, "You have seen that it has been useful up to the present moment, and I have explained to you how it will be continuously useful after he gets up here." That was the end of it. He didn't ring any more alarms. Presently I said, "He is disappointed, I think. He has gone off with the vegetables and the bric a brac, and I think he is dissatisfied."
His theory substantiated.
We went to sleep, and at a quarter before 8 in the morning I was out and hurrying, for I was to take the 8:29 train for New York, and I found the gas burning brightly, full head, all over the first floor. My new overcoat was gone, my old umbrella was gone, my new patent leather shoes, which I had never worn, were gone. The large window which opened into the ombra at the rear of the house was standing wide. I passed out through it and tracked the burglar down the hill through the trees, tracked him without difficulty, because he had blazed his progress with imitation silver napkin rings, and my umbrella, and various other things which he had disapproved of, and I went back in triumph and proved to my wife that he was a disappointed burglar. I had suspected he would be from the start, and from his not coming up to our floor to get human beings.
End of Section 33, December 28, 1924, Mark Twain's Burglar, and end of Mark Twain in the New York Times, Part 7, 1920 through 1924, by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman.